In the Jedi archives on Coruscant, one rule was treated as absolute. If a record did not appear in the archive, then it did not exist. For centuries, no name strained that rule more than Revan's. He had begun as a Padawan, risen to Knight, then Master, and with each step had become harder to define. He was hailed as a hero, denounced as a traitor, feared as a conqueror, and remembered as a savior. He had worn the robes of the Jedi, and later the armor of the Sith. He had saved the Republic, then tried to destroy it, then saved it again. So when he stood before the Council for the last time, the Masters could not agree on what to do with him. A handful wanted him cast out of the Order entirely. Others chose a quieter path. They would not disown him, and they would not embrace him. The tale of his redemption and return to the light spread across the galaxy, but the darker details of what the Jedi had done to him were carefully removed. The man behind the legend was locked inside the walls of the temple, and the parts of his life that did not suit the Order were shut away. This is the history the Council could not control, so they buried it. It begins with a war they refused to fight. It started in the Outer Rim, where Mandalorian raiders began striking Republic colonies on a scale the Senate could no longer dismiss. The scope of that campaign is charted in Legends reference works like the New Essential Chronology and Star Wars The Essential Atlas, which trace the war world by worlds across the Rim. What those records track is the movement of fleets. What the novel Revan sits with is the part the maps cannot show, the moment the Council chose not to respond. Whole worlds lived in fear, and as refugees streamed towards the core, pressure built for someone to act. The Republic Senate debated and delayed. The Jedi Council, sitting in its halls on Coruscant, chose to wait. That choice created the space for one young Jedi Knight to do the opposite. His name was Revan. With him was his closest friend and apprentice Malak. The Council would not move. They left the temple for the outer worlds and did what the Masters had refused to do. The Council opposed them openly and offered them to stand down. Revan and Malak ignored them. Instead, they pulled Jedi from across the Order, Knights, Padawans, former students, even those who had drifted from active service, and marched them into the war alongside Republic soldiers. What began as defiance quickly hardened into something larger, a chain of command of their own, built beyond the Council's reach. One of the first to join them was a young woman named Mitra Surik. Because she quickly proved herself a brilliant tactician and a natural military leader, Revan recognized her value at once, made her a general, and placed nearly half of the combined Republic and Jedi forces under her command. This was no longer a disagreement because what Revan had created in the field had already become a second Jedi hierarchy, complete with its own ranks and its own officers. Back at the temple, the old masters watched the war from a distance. Among them was Atris, once close to Mitra, and now firmly aligned with the Council's most conservative view. She had stayed out of the fighting because she believed, as they did, that Revan's defiance could not be allowed to stand, but on the battlefield, that judgment mattered less with every victory he won. Revan's army was the force actually turning the war. It met the Mandalorians world by world, system by system, and every success made his name larger across the galaxy. That was exactly what made him more dangerous inside the Order. Each victory strengthened his legend. Each loss only hardened the Masters against him. Some resented the cost in Jedi lives. Others resented something simpler and more threatening. Revan had shown that he could lead without them. As the war dragged on, the divide only deepened. Worlds burned, colonies were lost and retaken, and young Jedi who had known only the temple learned instead how to command troops, survive campaigns, and bury the dead. By the end, the conflict was no longer just a war against the Mandalorians. It had become a struggle over who would define the future of the Jedi Order itself. Revan meant to settle both struggles with one final victory, and that was why he chose Malachor 5. The planet mattered less than the space around it, where violent gravitational anomalies could be turned into a weapon. He already had that weapon prepared. The Mass Shadow Generator. It appears not only in the novel Revan, but also in the Prima official game guide for Knights of the Old Republic 2. The guide describes it with the cold precision of battlefield machinery. The novel lingers on what that machinery cost. Revan built the battle as a trap. He split his fleet in two, gave half to Mitra, and kept the rest for himself. While he engaged Mandalore directly, Mitra's fleet would draw the Mandalorians close to the planet and hold them there. The plan only worked if her ships remained in position long enough for the generator to fire. She held her position exactly as ordered, keeping the Mandalorians close enough to seal the trap around Malachor 5. When the generator fired, space itself folded inward, tearing apart every ship in orbit in a single instant. The Mandalorian fleet was destroyed there, and most of Mitra's was destroyed with it. The war ended in the same moment thousands of her own people died. Mitra survived, but barely. She had been close enough to the weapon that the shockwave nearly killed her. It left her vulnerable. At the same time, she felt the loss of the Mandalorians and her fellow soldiers through the Force. Every life, every voice, all of them cut off together. For a Jedi, it was beyond pain, because nothing in their training had prepared them to feel that many lives vanish at once. It became a wound her teachings could not contain, and with no way to endure it, she protected herself the only way she knew how. She cut herself off from the Force, and for years, it seemed permanent. What the weapon did to the planet was still. Malachor 5 did not simply become a dead world, it became a scar in the Force itself, a wound that would not heal. Any Force-sensitive who came near would feel echoes of unimaginable pain and suffering, the last moments of everyone who had died there, repeating in the currents of the Force. Malachor remained a place of extraordinary dread and trauma in the Force. Revan had won his war, but he had won it through a single calculated sacrifice that never stopped shadowing the victory. Years later, after his own memories of the event were gone, he would try to look back on those choices and find that he cannot fully explain or justify them, even to himself. He did not know whether he had understood what would happen. He did not know whether the plan had gone wrong or unfolded exactly as he had intended. The records were sealed after Malachor 5. The mission report was locked away in the Jedi archives under restricted access, and the men and women who had survived returned to a republic that had already decided it did not want to hear what they had endured. Mitra Surik, who had obeyed Revan's orders and paid for them more dearly than most, found that there was no place left for her in the world she had fought to save, so she simply walked away. Revan did not come home, and neither did Malak. With the Mandalorians broken, Revan chose to pursue the scattered remnants of their fleet beyond the edge of charted space. Malak went with him, past the Outer Rim, and into the unknown regions where Republic maps simply ended. Officially, they were finishing the war. In reality, they found something else. The two Jedi who had refused Council orders and won a war they were forbidden to fight did not return as heroes. They did not return as Jedi at all. What came back into Republic space were the same ships, but not the same men. Revan wore a different mask and carried a different title. So did Malak. They were called Darth now. When the Council finally offered an official explanation, they gave one that placed the blame on the ancient power of a Rakatan superweapon, a relic of a long-dead empire known as the Starforge. It had been in the unknown regions, they said, and it had bent the two men to its will. That was the version passed on to the Republic's historians. Even years later, Revan never fully accepted that explanation, because too much of what had happened to him remained hidden behind gaps in his own memory. He suspected there was more. He could not remember what it was. He could only remember that he had feared it on a deep, primal level. Something he had seen out there that was greater than the Mandalorians, greater than the Starforge, greater than anything the galaxy had yet faced. Whatever he had found, he came back to burn the Republic he had just saved. The Sith War that followed cost millions of lives, as the armies Revan had once built to protect the Outer Rim were turned against the Republic itself, and because of that, worlds fell and fleets burned. Cities that had hung his portrait as a liberator learned that the man in the portrait was now the one ordering them shelled. At his side stood Malak, no longer friend or student alone, but apprentice. For the Jedi, that new war did not erase the old one. Masters who had once resented Revan for leading thousands of their own to die in the Mandalorian Wars now watched him kill Republic soldiers and civilians by the million. The grievances piled on top of one another until none could be separated from the rest, and because of that, no single framing could contain him. He was, by turns, traitor and conqueror, apostate and emperor. Because the Republic somehow held on long enough, the Jedi were able to rally, and eventually, by means the Republic would never fully learn, the war against Darth Revan ended not in defeat on the battlefield, but with a strike team that managed, against long odds, to take the Dark Lord alive. What happened to Revan after his capture was not written into any ceremony. They saved Revan's life, but only by stripping his memories. Reaching into him through the Force, they took away the man he had been, then began rebuilding what remained. What they shaped was not the Revan who had defied them, and not the Darth who had burned Republic worlds, but a new man carrying pieces of both. And because Malak had already betrayed his master, fired on his flagship, and seized the remnant Sith Empire for himself, the Council suddenly had a use for Revan. They aimed him at the apprentice he had once trained, so they sent him out under the guidance of the young Jedi, Bastila Shan, and a small handful of companions, with the task of finding and killing Malak. For a time, the Council's gamble paid off. They rebuilt Revan, unaware for most of his journey of who he really was, hunted Malak across the galaxy. In doing so, he ended the Second War and saved the Republic a second time. But the deeper the hunt went, the more the old self began to return. His memories resurfaced in fragments, until by the time he faced Malak at the Starforge, he understood the truth completely. He knew that the hand the Council had raised against Malak was the same hand that had once raised Malak himself. He fought his apprentice and killed him anyway. The weapon the Council had forged recognized itself. When it was over, Revan returned to Coruscant as something the Jedi had no clear place for. To the Republic, the story was simple. The Senate awarded him the Cross of Glory, the highest honor it could give, and the ceremony was broadcast across the HoloNet. Across known space, people heard the same message. Revan had saved the Republic twice. But inside the temple, the truth was far less settled. Publicly, he had been redeemed and restored to the light. Privately, many masters did not believe redemption could erase what he had once become. The Council could give him a place in the public record. Within the Order, they still did not know what to call him. That uncertainty only deepened in the 2 years that followed, because during that time, Revan married Bastila. By Jedi standards, it was quiet, but it still broke doctrine outright. And to Revan, the marriage mattered for more than personal reasons. Bastila had been the one who found him, and during their hunt for Malak, she had briefly fallen to the dark side herself. Yet it had been his love that brought her back. Their bond had saved them both. To Revan, that made attachment more than emotion. It made it evidence that the Jedi had misunderstood something fundamental. By then, he had lived through both extremes of the Force. He had served the light completely, and he had fallen fully into the dark. He knew what it meant to deny emotion, and he knew what it meant to be consumed by it. Because he had known both, he came to believe that Jedi and Sith doctrine were flawed in the same way. To suppress emotion entirely was a fool's game. Jealousy was not simply evil waiting inside the soul. More often, it was what happened when a Jedi was taught to deny feeling instead of understanding it. From that, Revan drew a conclusion the Council could never have accepted. Love, loyalty, and happiness could strengthen a Jedi's bond to the Force, just as anger and hatred fed the dark side. So he brought that belief to the Council openly. He asked for a meeting and offered to share what he thought he had learned. What he received was not a debate, but hostility. Some masters wanted him banished outright. Others stopped short of that, not because they trusted him, but because they understood his legend was too useful to destroy. So they chose a colder compromise. Revan could remain within the Order, but only in silence. He could keep his place, his name, and his life in the temple, so long as he never taught what he had learned. The truth of what the Jedi had done to him was erased almost as completely as the man he had once been. The galaxy kept the legend because that was the version the Council allowed to survive. The truth stayed inside the temple, sealed away, with everything else that no longer fit the story. Around that same time, Meecha Surik returned after years of wandering, cut off from the Force and from the Order she had once followed into war. The Council did not welcome her back. Instead, they banished her. Atris, who had once been close to her, helped explain why. Meecha was no longer just a former Jedi. She had become a symbol of everyone who had defied the Council's will during the Mandalorian Wars. And once someone became a symbol, the Council no longer judged them as an individual. Mercy gave way to example, so Meecha was exiled, while Revan, the man who had led her into that war, was allowed to remain. It was a strange kind of arithmetic, but it reveals something more important about how the Council thought. Revan was dangerous, but still useful. Meecha represented disobedience itself, and symbols like that had to be pushed outside the walls. Revan noticed, and what happened to Meecha no longer looked like a single injustice. It looked like part of a larger pattern. The Council moved first against anything that threatened its authority, and that made him look again at the thing he had once encountered in the unknown regions. His memory of it had been damaged, but the fear had survived. It was still there, buried so deeply that it no longer needed clear shape or explanation. He knew with a certainty deeper than reason that what he had found beyond the edge of known space was worse than anything the Council had ever imagined, and he became convinced it was still waiting. He tried to warn others, but by then, he already knew what the Council would do. Even his allies spoke of it with a kind of weary certainty, as though the outcome had already been decided. They would say it almost without thinking, even if the Jedi Council refused to act again. And that word mattered, because it meant this was no longer a fear or a suspicion. The Council had begun noticing a pattern of its own. Bastila refused to return for retraining after everything she had endured, and some masters saw in that refusal the same danger they saw in Revan himself, another gifted Jedi drifting away from accepted doctrine. One exception had already caused enough damage. A second was intolerable, so Revan chose his companions carefully. He did not rely on the Jedi who still answered to the temple. He gathered people loyal to him, not the Council. Mitra came with him, her bond to the Force restored more deeply than she had believed possible. Together, they went into the unknown regions. For Revan, it was the second time he had crossed into that darkness. The first time, he had returned as a Sith Lord. This time, he said nothing to the Council at all. What they found began with Nathema, a dead world erased from charts and history by the Sith Emperor himself. Mitra felt the truth of it first. Malachor had screamed in the Force. Nathema did not scream at all. It was simply empty, a void so complete that it revealed the truth at once. Revan and Malak had not been turned by the Starforge. They had come here, seen what the Emperor could do, and knelt. What Nathema exposed was far worse than the Jedi had ever understood. The story told in the temple that Revan and Malak had been corrupted by the Starforge was not the truth, or not the whole of it. They had seen what was waiting in the dark beyond the Republic, and once Revan understood that, he pressed further. He crossed from the unknown regions into the hidden worlds of the Sith Empire itself, a civilization the Republic did not know existed, ruled by an immortal emperor whose name the Republic had never even heard. Once he understood what was waiting out there, he went after the Emperor directly. That choice led him into the Emperor's own throne chamber. Revan had come to end him, and he had brought allies because he knew no one reached that far alone. There, he fought with everything he had learned across 2 lifetimes of Force use. At the height of the battle, when the Emperor reached into his mind the same way the Jedi had years before, Revan answered with something no doctrine had prepared him to do. Because neither side alone was enough, he did not choose one. Instead of simply pressing forward, he opened himself to the Force and let both light and dark run through him like twin rushing rivers. He did not focus it or channel it, he released it in its purest form. It kept him alive. It did not win, and because he was taken alive, Revan was placed in a suspended cage of shimmering power, hanging somewhere between life and death. For however many centuries his body survived in stasis, Revan would fight back in the only way he still could, with his mind, against the mind of the thing that held him. He held on to that purpose to survive. If he could delay the Emperor's invasion of the Republic by 50 years, then Bastila might never have to endure the horrors of another galactic war. That was the measure and the goal, and while he fought for it in the dark, no one in the galaxy behind him knew where he was. The Jedi Council knew least of all. Because they knew nothing of what he had found, they understood nothing of what had happened. They did not know where Revan had gone. They did not know that Mitra had died in the same campaign. They did not know the name of the Sith Emperor, did not know he existed, did not know he had waited for centuries to march into the Republic. They knew only that Revan had disappeared, that he had broken his promise, and that he was gone. While Revan hung in his cage beyond the edge of the known galaxy, others in the Republic picked up fragments of what he and Malak had brought back from the unknown regions. A woman named Kreia, once a Jedi Master, gathered rogue Jedi around her and turned them toward the dark teachings Malak and Revan had uncovered. She took a new name, Darth Treya, and her followers called themselves the Sith after the long-lost species that had invaded the Republic a millennium before. They began a systematic purge of the galaxy, hunting down those who still held fast to the Jedi Code, killing them by the tens of thousands. The silence had not protected the Order. The silence had let the fire spread. Inside the temple, Malachor 5 remained sealed, and because it remained sealed, the mission reports stayed buried in a section of the archives that ordinary students could not open. Among the Jedi, it was often said that if a record did not appear in the archive, then it did not exist. That was the principle of their library. In time, it became the principle of their memory too. Bastila lived on after Revan's disappearance. She raised the son they had had together, a boy named Vaynor. She raised him outside the Order. Vaynor would never be a Jedi. If he had been, he could never have married the woman he eventually married and would never have become the political leader he became. He grew up instead into a statesman who helped hold the Republic together in the years after the Sith Purge. A Jedi family, broken by Jedi rules, produced one of the men who rebuilt the galaxy. Out in his cage, Revan did exactly what he had set out to do. Year after year, decade after decade, he held his ground. He could not win free, but he could resist, and resistance became delayed. Delay became pressure. Pressure turned the Emperor inward, toward Dromund Kaas, toward the hidden Sith worlds, and towards the fragile order of his own dominion. Whatever plans he had once made for open war against the Republic were pushed back, not for months, but for decades. He bought far more time than he ever knew, and far more than the Republic ever realized it had been given. For a while, that was enough to alter the course of events. The attack on the Emperor's throne chamber had not killed him, but it had changed his priorities. The Republic was no longer the prize immediately before him. Instead, he turned his attention inward, toward the hidden machinery of his own empire, toward the worlds he already ruled, and toward the unstable order he could not afford to let fracture. The Jedi Council never knew any of it. Revan's final mission had not been sanctioned, so when he vanished beyond the edge of known space, the Temple had no record that could explain where he had gone or why. They could not prepare later generations for the enemy he had found, because they did not know that enemy existed. To them, Revan had simply disappeared again, as he had before, into a darkness no one in the Order could name. And because they did not know, they said nothing. The silence that had begun as caution hardened over time into custom. One generation of masters passed it on to the next, until omission no longer felt like a decision at all, but like the natural order of things. Padawans came and went, years gave way to centuries, and the answer remained the same. Revan was not discussed in any way that mattered. Revan was a Sith the Jedi tried to erase from the record. The next major Sith to terrify the Order operated openly, and they wrote down everything they could about him. They still did not know how to stop him. The Sith was Darth Malgus, and his combat record is one of the densest in the entire Legends timeline. Darth Malgus was the most dangerous close-range combatant the Sith Empire ever produced, and the Legends sources back that claim with a combat record that most Sith Lords across the entire timeline cannot match. Every ability he cultivated, every technique he mastered, and every engagement he survived fed into a single purpose: overwhelming dominance at the point of contact. His physical conditioning, his lightsaber technique, and his command of the Force all pointed forward, into the fight where his power hit hardest. The foundation beneath all of it began with what he had done to his body and the specific Force ability that turned that body into something the Legends materials handled differently from any other Sith warrior on record. Chapter 1. The Physical Foundation. Malgus stood at roughly 2.2 meters tall, well over 7 feet, carrying a frame he had conditioned through decades of relentless physical training that went far beyond what the Sith Empire's largest warriors could match. The Empire had big fighters, yet Malgus was larger than most of them, and it spent more effort building on that size than the source material credits to any of his peers. Size alone, however, was not the separation. What sat on top of the frame was a specific Force ability called Force Rage, and it changed the rules of how he operated under sustained pressure. Force Rage was the dark side's answer to Force Valor, and the difference between the two explains why Malgus became more dangerous the longer a fight lasted, while almost every other fighter in the galaxy became weaker. Force Valor allows a Force user to flood their body with energy and push past their natural physical limits, raising strength, speed, and endurance beyond what the body could normally produce. Force Rage achieved the same result through Fury instead of Focus. It raised strength, speed, toughness, and resolve all at once, and it carried one property that Force Valor did not. It was self-feeding. A Jedi had to maintain deliberate concentration to keep Force Valor running, and that concentration degraded as exhaustion set in. Force Rage drew its fuel from the emotional state of the user, and as long as the anger held, the power held with it. The angrier Malgus became, the more the ability fed itself, and Malgus was always angry. That self-reinforcing loop inverted the normal arc of a prolonged engagement. Where most fighters wore down over time, Malgus escalated. Across a career that spanned nearly the entire Great Galactic War, this meant that every prolonged siege, every grinding campaign, and every drawn-out fight shifted in his favor as the hours passed, because the conditions that exhausted every other fighter on the field were the same conditions that made him stronger. The reason most Sith never reached this level of sustained output was that Force Rage carried a cost that the majority of its users could not survive long enough to overcome. The ability burned through the body's reserves at a rate that matched the power it produced, and for a fighter without the physical conditioning to absorb that drain, the result was collapse rather than escalation. The Legends material records Sith warriors who activated Force Rage in critical moments and gained a temporary advantage. The power became unsustainable. Malgus had built a frame specifically designed to carry that load over hours rather than minutes, and the decades of physical training that preceded his mastery of the ability were not incidental to it. They were the reason it worked for him in a way it did not work for anyone else. The combination was deliberate, and the source material treats it as unique to him within the Old Republic era. What that looked like in practice was a pattern of physical output that the Legends material documents with a consistency that goes beyond individual feats. His strikes carried enough force to fold armored opponents on impact. When he fought Darth Adras, a Sith Lord in full battle armor, a single kick cracked his ribs through the plating. Against Jedi, the novels describe him seizing opponents by the throat, lifting them off their feet, and either closing his grip or driving them into surfaces hard enough to end the fight on contact. That finishing method was a preference rather than a fallback, and the source material records him using it repeatedly against opponents who had personally displeased him, closing his grip not because it was efficient, but because he wanted them to know who was doing it. His durability under Force Rage made wearing him down through sustained pressure almost useless. During the Battle of Alderaan, Republic Commander Jace Malcolm struck him with rockets at close range that engulfed his body in a blinding explosion and scarred his face. And Malgus stood back up. Satele Shan then gathered everything she had and released two sequential force blasts. The first pinned him against the face of a cliff, and the second tore the cliff apart and collapsed the rock on top of him. He survived, though his respiratory system was permanently damaged and he wore a mechanical respirator for the rest of his life. His frame was further reinforced with cybernetics following the injuries, yet the damage never reduced his combat ability. He adapted and continued, and the respirator became a fixture on every battlefield that followed. Even in a weakened state, his connection to the Force through rage kept his output beyond what should have been possible. After one engagement left him buried under two buildings worth of debris, he pushed the entire mass off himself through raw telekinesis while still recovering, and that kind of output from a fighter who was already injured tells the full story of what the physical foundation meant. Everything else in his arsenal was built on top of it, starting with a lightsaber method that turned that physical advantage into something far more dangerous. Chapter 2: The Lightsaber Method. There were Sith Lords in the Legends timeline whose technical range with a lightsaber exceeded what Malgus could do, yet his approach was built for a specific purpose, and against that purpose, almost no one had an answer. His foundation was Form 5, specifically the Gem So variant, a power attack system designed to overwhelm a guard through sheer mechanical force rather than outmaneuver an opponent through footwork. This was not an unusual choice for a physically powerful fighter. Yet what made Malgus unusual was how completely he had stripped the form down to its most destructive elements. Most Gemso users maintained the full range of Form 5 technique, including parries, redirections, and counterstrikes that allowed shifting between offense and defense. Malgus kept the offense and cut away most of the rest so that every exchange was designed to break through whatever was in front of him. and every strike carried enough weight that even a successful block created a problem for the person holding the other blade. The Deceived novel records Aaron Lanier, a trained Jedi Knight, blocking one of his overhead strikes and physically staggering backward on contact, losing ground despite having technically defended herself. The block worked, yet it did not matter, because the force behind the strike turned a successful defense into a losing position. This is the clearest illustration of what made his stripped-down approach viable. The standard counter to a power-heavy offense is a solid guard, and against Malgus, a solid guard bought time without changing the outcome. Stripping away the defensive framework of a lightsaber form should have created openings that a skilled opponent could exploit. Yet the same ability that powered his offense also eliminated the gaps it should have left. Force Rage meant the force behind every strike was already beyond natural limits, so opponents could not easily punish his forward pressure because the strikes came too fast and too heavy to step into safely. The punishment he could absorb meant that hits which would have ended most engagements did not register as meaningful against him, and the Journal of Master Nostaral describes his lightsaber form as containing no gaps worth targeting, written after an engagement requiring the finest available combatants working together. However, the record shows his abilities were not limited to offense. A separate engagement described in the novel shows Malgus moving his blade through a defensive pattern fast enough that it became, in the text's own words, a continuous smear of red light rather than separate movements. He was covering troops on an open battlefield, and not a single blaster bolt made it through, which suggests working knowledge of Form 3, Suresu, though the source material never records him using it in a lightsaber duel. He reserved it for the battlefield, where protecting his soldiers required a different tool than the one he used to destroy individual opponents. The combat record he built under these conditions stands as one of the most complete in Old Republic-era legends, and the names on it carry weight. Jedi Master Ven Zalo had never lost a duel and had cut down Sith in open battle the way a trained soldier moves through fighters who are out of their depth. He was widely considered one of the finest combat practitioners the Order had produced in that generation, and Malgus had become fixated on fighting him. When they first met at the Jedi Temple during the sacking of Coruscant, the Deceived novel does not describe the engagement as one-sided. Zalo pressed him, and for a sustained stretch, the outcome was not present. His technique was clean, his resolve was total, and his record entering the fight suggested he had every reason to expect a victory. Malgus won, and the respect he showed afterward, a genuine acknowledgement that the victory had been earned against a worthy opponent, underlines that Zalo had been fighting at full capacity when he fell. That victory matters for the power question because Zalo was not a mid-tier Jedi. He was one of the best the Order had, and he lost to Malgus in a fair engagement. Aaron Lanier, Zalo's former Padawan, engaged Malgus twice and lost both times. In the second engagement, she attempted to use Malgus's lover, Alina Daru, as leverage, which exposed the one emotional weakness he could not suppress. The novel makes clear what that bought her: a few seconds of advantage and a handful of strikes on his body. Malgus converted the pain into fuel through Force Rage, and the rate at which she was losing ground increased after she had landed them. Against Darth Adras in a Sith versus Sith engagement, the gap was not close. Adras attempted Force Lightning as his primary option, and Malgus caught it on his blade with a single motion and sent it back. The novel describes the movement in terms that suggest clearing away something trivial. Adras was operating at full desperation, and Malgus was performing. The ceiling of the record sits at the 1-against-4 engagement against a strike team composed of the greatest heroes of the Great Galactic War. Malgus held that fight for a significant stretch before eventually being captured rather than finished. The hero of Tython, writing afterward, described his lightsaber form as perfect and containing no flaws, an assessment written by someone who had just survived finding that out firsthand. 4 elite combatants working together produce a capture rather than a clean victory, and that tells the story of what Malgus was at the blade. Yet the blade was only one layer of what made him dangerous, and the Force abilities operating behind it worked at a completely different scale. Chapter 3: The Force Arsenal. When Venzalo attempted to resist a force push from Malgus, the result was not a contested exchange. Zalo went through a stone pillar, and the pillar broke around him on impact. His command of the Force was not refined or precise. It was raw power applied at a scale that made precision unnecessary, and the results put him beyond what most Sith Lords of his era could produce. His telekinesis functioned as an extension of the same forward pressure approach that defined his lightsaber work. And the Zalo moment was not an outlier. When the strike team of great galactic Civil War heroes engaged him, Malgus opened the fight by descending from a height, driving his hands forward, and sending all four of them reeling at once with a single opening move. Against hidden targets, detection and attack merged into one action. The Deceived novel records an ambush where multiple Jedi had taken concealed positions and were actively masking their Force signatures. Malgus felt the faint trace of the light side, pushed past their concealment, located a specific knight, and closed his grip on the knight's throat through the Force before the ambush could begin. On another occasion, when Darth Adras attempted a leaping attack, Malgus plucked him out of the air at the highest point of his jump and drove him into the ground. When he released his rage without directing it at a specific target, the Force repulse that followed was environmental rather than personal. Objects, people, and in at least one recorded case, a ship in a nearby landing position went in every direction at once. Not because the ship was a target, but because it was simply within range when the power left his body. The tactical consequence of that kind of undirected output was that it removed the standard approach to fighting a close-range specialist. The conventional response to a fighter who dominates at short notice is to surround him, force him to divide his attention, and attack from angles he cannot cover simultaneously. The Force repulse made that tactic self-defeating, because the moment multiple opponents closed to striking range was precisely the moment the ability was most likely to activate, and everyone within that radius absorbed the full output at once. The strike team engagement confirmed the problem. 4 elite combatants working together still could not find a formation that denied him the ability to hit all of them at the same time. His Force lightning was dependable across engagements in a way that separated him from users who could produce it, but cannot rely on it under sustained combat pressure. Against single targets, it functioned as a primary offensive tool when the situation called for ranged engagement. Against Darth Adras, it disarmed him and stopped his advance cold without Malgus needing to close distance. Against Aaron Lear's 2 lightsaber defensive stands in the final engagement of the Deceived novel, the lightning drove through her guard, stripped both blades from her hands, and threw her from the shuttle they were fighting on, and the pain was severe enough that she lost consciousness shortly after. Against groups, the output operated at a different scale entirely. During the Jedi Temple assault, Malgus targeted a single Jedi Knight across a chaotic battlefield, and the lightning cut a path through the fighting, ended 2 Padawans who happened to be standing between him and the target, and then reached the Knight and lifted her from her feet. He had aimed for 1 person, and 3 Jedi fell because the output was wide enough to catch everyone in its path, turning a single target ability into an area weapon without deliberate intent. Beyond telekinesis and lighting, Malgus had developed a rare vocal force ability that appears in only a handful of entries across the entire Legends timeline, and at higher output, its results were devastating. The Force Bellow was different from a standard Force Scream in both mechanism and purpose. Where the Force Scream destabilized an enemy's connection to the Force, the Bellow converted the user's voice into direct physical force, and the gap between the two in terms of destructive output was significant. At lower output, Malgus used it to shatter a large stone column and send the fragments tearing through enemy formations. At higher output, aboard his own flagship, the Lindworm, during the retreat from Ord Radama, Malgus released a bellow in a moment of rage that buckled the bridge's viewport, burst the eardrums of every crew member, and produced sound waves powerful enough to overload the fuel cells of an incoming Republic starfighter wave, destroying the entire formation. The Book of Sith records this from Malgus' own journal, and it does not appear in most Sith records because most Sith did not have the Force presence required to produce it. However, raw power without direction is only destruction, and what separated Malgus from the Sith who scorched themselves out was that he understood how to point it. Chapter 4. power applied at scale. During the siege of Ord Radama, Malgus faced a fortified mountain stronghold accessible only through a narrow path swept by enemy fire, and rather than sending infantry forward to absorb the losses, he led the column himself. He and Darth Venomel walked the front of the advance, using their lightsabers to form a continuous defensive screen against incoming fire, while the troops moved behind the cover their blades provided. This was the same Form 3 capability the novel documented in his individual combat record, now scaled from protecting himself to protecting an entire advancing column. When Malgus discovered that the enemy had laid mines along the path, his response demonstrated exactly what his telekinetic power looked like when pointed at a tactical problem rather than a single opponent. He tore a boulder from the mountainside with telekinesis and rolled it ahead of the advance, detonating every mine in the path before a single soldier reached the threat, then flung the same boulder into the enemy's gun positions, clearing the defensive line in a single throw. The same telekinetic ability that had sent Van Zalo through a stone pillar and hurled 4 elite fighters backward was now being used to clear minefields and destroy fortifications. The Book of Sith records these events from Malgus' own journal, and Darth Sidious, annotating the journal thousands of years later, noted the approach with approval, stating that Force users should always lead those without the Force. That Sidious citation carries weight because it was written by someone who had watched Darth Vader operate at full power and still found Malgus' battlefield record worth noting. The distinction Sidious identified was not just raw strength, but the way Malgus applied it to multiply the effectiveness of every soldier around him. His lightsaber defense covered the troops behind him. His telekinesis removed the obstacles they could not survive, and his presence at the front meant the most powerful combatant on the field was also the first one the enemy had to deal with. The practical effect was that engagements which should have stalled at fortified positions ended before the defenders could use their advantage, because the Force abilities that most Sith reserve for personal combat were being applied to the problems that stopped conventional armies. The sacking of Coruscant demonstrated the same principle at an even larger scale. Malgus did not simply participate in the assault on the Jedi Temple, he led the spearhead that breached it, personally cutting through the temple's defenders, while the warriors behind him exploited the gaps his advance created. The assault succeeded because the point of the Imperial formation was a single Sith Lord whose combat output exceeded what the defensive architecture was built to absorb. The defenders who survived the initial breach described the experience as facing a siege weapon that could also fight individual duels, and the speed at which the temple fell reflected the difference between an assault led by infantry and an assault led by Malgus. This pattern of applying personal combat power at the operational level repeated throughout the Great Galactic War, and the results were campaigns that succeeded where standard doctrine predicted failure. They raised the final question, which is where all of this power actually placed him in the Legends hierarchy. Chapter 5: The Ceiling and Legacy. Placing Malgus in the Legends power hierarchy requires looking at what the sources actually document rather than what reputation alone would suggest, and the sources are consistent about both where his ceiling fell and what he achieved beneath it. He was not the most powerful Sith of his era. Vitiate, later known as Valkorion, occupied a tier that does not sit on the same scale. The Old Republic game describes a ritual anathema that consumed every living thing on the planet and stripped the Force from the world permanently, and Vitiate had been operating at that level for over 1,000 years before Malgus was born. A direct confrontation between them would not have been a contest, because Vitiate's power operated at a scope that personal combat ability, no matter how developed, could not answer. Darth Jadis presents a similar problem one tier lower. His Force presence was dense enough that other Force users described it as a change in the atmosphere of a room, and his combat abilities placed him above Malgus based on the available evidence. Yet the tier below those two is where the analysis becomes more useful, and that is where Malgus' record earns its real weight. The comparison that positions Malgus in rough range of Darth Revan has a basis in the record, though the two operated in fundamentally different ways. Revan was exceptional in areas Malgus was not. The combination of light and dark side mastery, strategic intelligence at a galactic scale, and raw force sensitivity significant enough to draw Vitiate's personal attention across decades. The Legends materials place Revan above Malgus at the peak of both their capabilities. Yet the gap was not enormous in the specific area of direct combat. Malgus had taken a narrower set of abilities and pushed them further than Revan's combat record shows in direct engagement, and his Form 5 mastery stands on a level that only a small number of Sith in all of Legends could claim. What makes Malgus more powerful than a power ranking entry is that the sources show he understood exactly where his power worked and where it did not, and he built every engagement around those conditions rather than pretending the limits were not there. The permanent damage he carried from Alderaan proved both the ceiling and the cost. Only someone fighting at Satele Shan's level, able to operate beyond the range where his abilities were strongest, could have achieved that result, and the injury never removed him from a single battlefield afterward. What Satele Shan specifically exploited was the gap that his entire method was built around closing. Malgus was built to end fights at close range, and every ability in his arsenal was designed to get him there and keep him there. Shan recognized that the only way to survive him was to never let him set those conditions, and she used the Force at a distance and scale that kept him outside the range where his advantages applied. The fact that it took a fighter of her caliber, someone who would go on to lead the entire Jedi Order, to find and exploit that gap, is itself a measure of how narrow the window was. Within that range, the Legends material does not record anyone who consistently matched what he could do. He defeated Jedi Masters with unbroken records, returned Force Lightning to the Sith Lords who sent it, overwhelmed an entire bridge crew with his voice, absorbed damage that should have ended his career, and continued fighting at the same level for every engagement that followed. His weaknesses were real, and they were the inverse of his strengths. Opponents who could engage him from outside his effective range, or who could bring enough coordinated power to deny him the conditions his method required, could find the edges of what he could do. Yet those edges were narrow, and reaching them required resources that most opponents simply did not have. What the full record shows is not just that Malgus was among the strongest Sith the Old Republic produced, but that the way he built his power, by choosing a single direction and refusing to stop pushing, created a fighter that the Legends timeline never produced again. Malgus built power by choosing one direction and refusing to stop. The ancient Sith would have respected that. They would not have respected the Sith who eventually won. Palpatine's victory looked like the dream every ancient Sith had been working towards, but by the standards those ancient Sith left behind, he was the greatest failure their tradition ever produced.
Every ancient Sith who ever lived would have judged Palpatine as a failure. Not because he failed to gain power, but because he destroyed everything the Sith stood for while winning. This judgment is possible because ancient Sith preserved their philosophy through spirits, holocrons, and temples that still function thousands of years later. On Korriban, Darth Bane's presence lingers in the ancient tombs, demonstrating a philosophy that lasted 1,000 years. On Malachor, the temple continues testing seekers thousands of years after its construction, guarding secrets that have been buried with the dead for millennia. Lord Momin's consciousness survived within his mask for just as long, and when Darth Vader recovered it, Momin evaluated his training and found it corrupt at the source. Exar Kun's spirit achieved similar persistence in the Yavin 4 temples, influencing those who entered for 4,000 years after his death. These preserved consciousnesses contain the values and judgments of their era, allowing us to measure Palpatine against standards recorded in Sith tradition. Across both canon and legends, from the old Sith Empire to Darth Bane's rule of two, Sith philosophy remained remarkably consistent. Whether ruling openly or hiding in shadows, knowledge preservation, succession through combat, and eventual open rule defined what it meant to be Sith. These principles allowed the Sith to survive for 5,000 years, despite repeated defeats and near extinction. By these standards, Palpatine betrayed the entire tradition. 5 specific reasons explain why every ancient Sith would have despised him, despite his unprecedented success. First, the ancient Sith established succession through proven strength thousands of years before Bane formalized the rule of two. In the Golden Age of the Sith, Mark Aragnos ruled the Sith Empire for over a century, and when he died, his spirit appeared to declare that the victor between Naga Sadow and Ludo Kresh would rule, because strength determined leadership. The strongest rose, while the weak fell, and every transition of power proved the new ruler deserved the position. This was not cruelty, but philosophy. The Sith Order could only grow stronger if its leaders earned their place through demonstrated superiority. When Naga Sadow's empire collapsed after his failed invasion of the Republic, he fled to Yavin 4, but still trained Frida Nad in the ways of the Sith. Nad eventually surpassed his master and claimed power for himself on Onderon. Centuries later, according to Tales of the Jedi, Exar Kun sought out Nad's spirit for instruction, then destroyed that spirit to prove his own superiority and claim the title of Dark Lord. Each generation overthrew the previous because that overthrow demonstrated growth. For millennia, this cycle defined Sith succession. Student surpasses teacher, takes the mantle, trains the next generation, and eventually falls to a stronger successor. Darth Bane studied these ancient traditions and preserved their core philosophy in the Rule of Two. He reduced the number from thousands to 2, but the principle remained the same. The apprentice must eventually surpass and destroy the master. In the Darth Bane trilogy, he informed his apprentice Zana that when her power eclipsed his, he would become expendable, and that she must eliminate him to claim the mantle of Dark Lord. He accepted this future and planned for it, understanding that his death at her hands would prove the Sith grew stronger with each generation. Similarly, in the Clone Wars episode Sacrifice, his presence on Moraband still challenged visitors to kill him to gain his place, demonstrating that this ancient principle survived through his reforms. Bane acknowledged he might never see the Sith triumph, accepting that centuries might pass before victory. He reflected that the path ahead would be long and difficult, potentially taking years, decades, or even centuries before the Sith could strike at the Jedi once more. Though he himself might not live to see the triumph of the dark side, those following him would carry on his legacy. Bane built a system expecting he would never witness its ultimate success, accepting his own mortality as necessary for the tradition's strength. Though Palpatine achieved everything the ancient Sith and Bane dreamed of, he refused to be replaced. A millennium of patient planning culminated in total victory when the Jedi fell, the Sith ruled, and the galaxy bowed to a Dark Lord. However, he then did something no ancient Sith or Baneite successor ever imagined possible. The Legends novel Dark Lord: The Rise of Darth Vader reveals his true intention. Once Sidious achieved immortality through the dark side, there would be no real reason to have an apprentice except to honor tradition. He planned to rule alone forever, transforming succession from a sacred principle into a ceremonial gesture without purpose. Both Plagueis and Sidious believed they had transcended Bane's system. According to the Darth Plagueis novel, Plagueis maintained that the Rule of Two had ended with their partnership. They would rule together, immortal, never needing successors. Sidious killed him for that belief, then adopted the exact same philosophy himself. Once he achieved immortality, he planned to rule alone with powerless apprentices who could never threaten him. Plagueis failed because he thought the Rule of Two no longer applied to him. Sidious failed for the same reason. Vader discovered the suit was never meant to make him stronger, but to keep him weak. He recognized that the damaged body and constant pain were designed to ensure that the apprentice could never challenge his master. Sidious did not save Vader on Mustafar out of compassion, but allowed him to burn and then rebuilt him weaker than before. When Vader confronted Sidious about this, gesturing to his scarred face and mechanical limbs, he asked whether these were the faces of victory. Sidious could not answer. Palpatine revealed his true philosophy when he told Vader that Vader's power was his power. This was not the Rule of Two, but ownership. Bane expected apprentices to grow until they could kill their masters. Palpatine expected Vader's strength to remain an extension of his own will forever. His strategy remained clear throughout his reign: maintain whatever apprentice survived as long as they remained controllable rather than superior. Ancient Sith and Bainite traditions alike required stronger successors to replace weaker masters, but Sidious inverted this principle completely. The second reason involves how ancient Sith preserved knowledge for future generations, while Palpatine hoarded it for himself. On Malachor, the ancient Sith embedded their philosophy into architecture itself. The temple's holocron waited thousands of years, guarded by a presence that tested seekers with questions about knowledge and power. Anonymous Sith who died millennia ago still taught students they would never meet, and though their names were forgotten, their teachings endured. Friedan Nad exemplified this dedication to teaching across generations. 4 centuries after his death, his spirit still sought Force sensitives to instruct. According to Tales of the Jedi, his ghost promised to find and teach any worthy student wherever they went. This was not passive preservation, but active membership. Nad understood that a Sith Lord's duty extended beyond their own lifetime, and death was not an excuse to stop teaching. Nad died once and taught for 400 years. Palpatine died twice and taught no one. Ancient Sith created holocrons recording their knowledge of sorcery, alchemy, and the dark side. Each generation added to the collective understanding, building a library of dark side wisdom that spanned millennia. In the Rebels episode, The Holocrons of Fate, the Bendu describes Sith holocrons as keepers of shadow lore, warning that combining them could reveal any secret, wisdom, or destiny through the Force. Ancient Sith recorded their teachings so future generations could build upon them and potentially achieve levels of insight no single Sith could reach alone. Darth Bane understood this ancient principle and nearly killed himself preserving it. In the Darth Bane trilogy, Bane failed 3 times creating his holocron. Each attempt took months of gathering rare crystals and fashioning intricate matrices, only to end in glimmering dust. He kept trying anyway, because holocrons had been the most valuable tool for passing on the legacy of great Sith Lords for many centuries. Bane understood that knowledge must survive the one who holds it, and personal triumph meant nothing if the wisdom died with the victor. He succeeded on his 4th attempt because preserving knowledge for those who came after mattered more than any personal frustration. Palpatine had access to everything those ancient Sith created, yet used none of it to build forward. Plagueis showed Sidious authentic Bainite holocrons containing wisdom accumulated by generations of Sith Lords, each acting to the collective understanding of the dark side. Sidious studied them, learned from them, and understood their purpose completely, but never created one himself. Instead, he placed forgeries in the Jedi Temple as Sith disinformation while hoarding real knowledge. These fake holocrons served as deceptions designed to mislead anyone who found them. Ancient Sith recorded wisdom for successors, while Palpatine recorded lies for enemies and nothing for the future. Sidious even acknowledged that ancient Sith possessed the very immortality knowledge he sought, but it was lost due to poor preservation. He understood the lesson that failure to properly preserve knowledge meant losing it forever, then repeated the exact same mistake by pursuing immortality secrets while creating nothing that would survive him. For the third reason, Lord Momin directly condemned Palpatine's teaching after surviving for thousands of years. In the Darth Vader 2017 comic series, Momin's consciousness had survived within his mask, giving him a perspective no living being possessed. When he evaluated Vader's training, he believed that he had been poorly taught about what the dark side is and why the Sith must serve it. He assessed that Vader's master was either ignorant or hoarding knowledge, and expressed sadness at seeing the Sith become Jedi-obsessed weaklings. This represented an ancient Sith explicitly condemning modern Sith philosophy based on standards preserved across millennia. Momin explained what Palpatine refused to accept. The dark side does not serve its users, but rather They serve it. If the Sith glorify the dark side through their acts, their work, and their art, it gives them power and even life eternal. His own survival proved this point, as he noted that empires had risen and fallen since his birth and great ages of the galaxy had passed, yet he still remained. Thousands of years had passed, and he persisted through proper service to the dark side, while Palpatine would die at his apprentice's hands because he tried to make the dark side serve him rather than the reverse. The ancient Sith understood that the dark side is sacred but also hungry, and it must always be fed. Those who serve it properly receive power, but those who try to hoard it or make it serve personal ambitions find themselves consumed. Momin survived thousands of years, while Palpatine died within one generation, proving which philosophy actually worked. He posed one question that destroys everything Palpatine taught. He asked Vader, why, if the greatest power in the galaxy was truly his to control, his wife was dead. She was not alive because the teaching had failed, and the promise was a lie. Palpatine told Anakin the dark side could prevent death, yet Padme died anyway. The dark side grants power to those who serve it properly, not those who try to command it for personal desires. Momin understood this truth, while Palpatine never did. The fourth reason involves how ancient Sith trained apprentices as genuine successors, while Palpatine manufactured disposable weapons. The Korriban academies trained dozens of students simultaneously, with masters dedicating years to developing their potential. The weak died and the strong rose, but every student received genuine instruction in Sith philosophy, combat, and the dark side of the Force. Ancient Sith masters wanted their apprentices to surpass them because superior apprentices meant a stronger order. Training a successor was not a burden, but a duty, and the greatest Sith Lords were remembered as much for who they trained as for what they conquered. The tombs on Korriban were designed not just as monuments, but as final tests, continuing to teach any student worthy enough to survive their trials. Star Wars: The Old Republic shows that Tulak Horde personally trained warriors who went on to become legendary in their own right. Mark Aragnos mentored an entire generation of Sith Lords during his century of rule, shaping the very nature of Sith civilization. Even the spirits of dead Sith continued to instruct the living, appearing to guide promising students toward their destiny. The ancient Sith understood that investing in apprentices strengthened the entire order and ensured the tradition would survive any individual's death. Palpatine, however, treated every apprentice as a tool with an expiration date. In the Rebels episode Twilight of the Apprentice, Maul explained that the Sith took everything from him by ripping him from his mother's arms, murdering his brother, using him as a weapon, and then casting him aside. He recalled that he once had power, but now had nothing. This was not the complaint of a failed apprentice who lost in fair combat, but the testimony of someone who was never given the chance to succeed. In the Legends novel Darth Plagueis, Sidious admitted that Maul was not an apprentice, and not someone who could ever aspire to become a true Sith Lord, but simply someone skilled in stealth and combat who could be eliminated when no longer needed. This represented disposal through convenience rather than succession through strength. Maul was never trained to surpass his master, but only to serve until he was no longer useful. When Obi-Wan Kenobi defeated him on Naboo, Sidious did not mourn a potential successor, but simply acquired a new tool in Count Dooku. Dooku received the same treatment, and when Anakin Skywalker proved more promising, Sidious engineered Dooku's death without hesitation. Every apprentice was disposable, every successor temporary, every heir designed to fail. Even after Sidious abandoned him, Maul still sought an apprentice because the Sith drive to train a successor ran that deep. On Malachor, Maul claimed Ezra Bridger as his apprentice, and he genuinely wanted Ezra to join him. Maul had lost his brother, Savage Opress, and spent years alone, and he saw in Ezra a potential companion and successor. He taught Ezra that anger was a wellspring and that passions give strength. Yet Maul was so broken by Sidious that the only way he knew to build a relationship was through manipulation and exploitation. He used their force bond to torment Ezra, tried to sever him from his friends, and ultimately used him to draw out Obi-Wan Kenobi. Ancient Sith trained successors to carry on their legacy, but Maul could only replicate what Sidious had done to him. Palpatine's corruption ran so deep that even the genuine impulse to train an apprentice became twisted into exploitation. Finally, the ancient Sith who founded and shaped the Order would condemn how Palpatine achieved his victory. Ancient Sith valued strength proven through direct confrontation. On Malachor, the scale of ancient Sith ambition remains visible in stone. The temple was not a hidden bunker, but a monument powerful enough that the Jedi attacked with thousands of warriors in open battle. The ancient Sith announced their power to the galaxy. They fought openly, died openly, and left monuments to their strength that still stand millennia later. The petrified warriors on Malachor testified to a battle so massive it transformed both sides into stone, yet the temple survived as a testament to Sith resolve. Order 66 was the opposite. Clones executing hidden programming, shooting generals in the back, betraying commanders who trusted them. Ki-Adi-Mundi was gunned down by soldiers he led. Troops gunned down Aayla Secura, and Plo Koon's own wingmen shot down his starfighter. The Emperor achieved victory through manufactured crises, Senate votes, and soldiers who did not even know they served the Sith cause. Ancient Sith would have called this cowardice, not conquest. This deception would have disgusted Ajunta Pall, who, in Knights of the Old Republic, founded the Sith Order on Korriban with the explicit intention of building something that would outlast him. Paul and the other Dark Jedi exiles created a civilization, not a conspiracy. They built temples, established academies, and trained generations of successors. Thousands of years after his death, his tomb still taught lessons to those who entered, and his ghost still reflected on the legacy he had created. Palpatine, however, structured everything around his permanent survival, then allowed the Order to die with him. Paul would see the Emperor as an anti-founder who destroyed what the first Dark Lord created. For 5,000 years, ancient Sith failed to destroy the Jedi, yet Palpatine succeeded and then destroyed the Sith himself. The Great Hyperspace War ended in Naga Sadow's defeat, and Exar Kun's War concluded in the same failure. Mandalorian Wars and Jedi Civil War weakened the Republic but never broke the Order. Even the massive battle on Malachor produced no clear victor. Despite every assault across 5 millennia, the Jedi survived by adapting, rebuilding, and enduring. No matter how powerful the Sith became, or how devastating their attacks proved, the Jedi Order always found a way to continue. Palpatine achieved what his predecessors could not when Order 66 destroyed the Jedi Order completely. This was the culmination of 1,000 years of planning, the ultimate goal every Bainite Sith had worked toward. He accomplished the impossible goal that motivated a millennium of Bainite succession by winning the war that every previous Sith had lost. Then, he destroyed the future by failing to ensure anyone could continue what he built. When Vader killed Palpatine, the Rule of Two worked exactly as designed, yet it destroyed the tradition along with the Master. When Vader threw him down the reactor shaft on the second Death Star, no heir existed to continue the Sith lineage. Palpatine had sabotaged every potential successor. At the celebration on Endor, Luke Skywalker saw 3 Force ghosts: Obi-Wan Kenobi, Yoda, and Anakin Skywalker, redeemed and returned to the light. 3 Jedi spirits endured, while 0 Sith remained. Palpatine had promised Anakin the power to cheat death, seducing him with visions of saving Padme and promises that the dark side offered abilities the Jedi considered unnatural. He never taught the technique. The Jedi he tried to exterminate achieved immortality through the Force, while the Sith tradition he claimed to master ended in permanent extinction. Even resurrection could not save Palpatine's legacy. In Dark Empire, he returned in cloned bodies, yet still created no holocron, trained no true successor, and preserved no teachings. He achieved a form of immortality and repeated the same mistakes that led to his first death. The clones were vessels for his consciousness, not students to train. He returned from death having learned nothing and changed nothing. Momin failed to destroy a city and called it failure, then sought to improve his next creation. Palpatine succeeded in destroying the Jedi and called it victory, then made the exact same errors when given a second chance. Even the heretic whose teachings the Sith rejected understood what the Emperor never grasped. Failure teaches, but only if you learn. Sidious called the ancient Sith fools for sharing power, yet their order survived 5,000 years, while his died with him. He dismissed their entire civilization as a mistake, yet the Sith he mocked built an order that endured through empires rising and falling, through wars lost and won, and through near extinction and resurgence. Sidious ended the Sith by refusing to share power with even one worthy successor. The Sith Code, preserved for 5,000 years, concludes with a promise that through victory, chains are broken and the Force grants freedom. Victory was meant to bring liberation, but Palpatine's victory created new chains instead. He trapped Vader in a broken body designed to keep him weak, abandoned Maul when he was no longer useful, and bound himself to constant vigilance against any successor who might threaten him. The Sith Code promises freedom through the dark side, yet Palpatine used the dark side to imprison everyone, himself included. The Sith Lord who called the ancient Sith fools would be remembered by those same ancient Sith as the greatest fool of all, not because he failed to gain power, but because he failed to understand what every Sith before him knew. Power without legacy is just noise before silence. Victory without continuation is just a longer path to the same defeat. The 1,000-year lineage Bane created ended not in glorious succession, but in total extinction.
Palpatine's failure was that he never understood the ancient Sith he replaced. The ancient Sith operated across power scales that the Empire era never produced again. 7 separate tiers, ranging from disposable Academy students up to beings who chose to keep living past every span of time that should have killed them. The Sith at the top of that ranking did things Palpatine would have called impossible. Vitiate gathered his followers on a single planet and performed one ritual. When it was finished, the planet was dead, not just the people on it, but the planet itself in the Force. Force sensitives who walked its surface thousands of years earlier felt nothing at all. But it didn't start there. Not every Sith is the same kind of threat. Some rule galaxies, while others manipulated events from the shadows across entire generations, and a few became so consumed by the dark side that they stopped being people entirely. And some of them, the ones at the very top, found a way to simply refuse to die. 7 levels, and each one answers a different question, not just how powerful a Sith is, but what kind of power they believe in, what they spend to get it, and what that belief slowly turns them into. The further up you go, the harder it becomes to recognize what came in at the bottom. Most students who walked into the Sith Academy on Korriban never walked out. The Academy was not a school, but a deliberate filter. In The Path of Destruction by Drew Karpyshyn, a Legends novel, it served one function. Students competed under live conditions with real consequences, and most would not survive to the next stage. The question with Expendables is not who they are, but what the system is using them for. Thoharg walked into Korriban looking like exactly the kind of student the Academy rewarded. He was aggressive, physically strong, and ready to use violence to dominate anyone weaker than him. On the surface, that made him look dangerous, but in reality, it made him exactly the profile the Academy had the most of. What he didn't realize was that the traits the Academy praised were the same traits that made him replaceable: aggressive enough to survive a fight, cruel enough to fit the culture, strong enough to look like a candidate, but nothing rare enough that losing him would cost the system anything. The Academy did not need Foharg to become something greater. It needed him to burn out in front of someone who would. And this is the part of the Sith tradition that gets lost behind the spectacle of their greatest figures. The worldview treats people as fuel from day one. It is not a late-stage corruption that only appears at the Void tier or at the Eternal tier. It is the foundation every higher tier is built on. The Sith who eventually consumed planets or bodies for centuries were trained at 15 years old inside a system that was already doing the same thing to them in miniature. This tier is also where every Sith begins, whether they stay or not. Darth Bane, the architect of the Rule of Two generations later, entered Korriban the same way, as a late recruited former Cortosis miner named Acel, who the system was ready to use and discard. The difference between Foharg and Bane was not where they started, it was what they did with the time the Academy gave them before it was done with them. Some survived it. Almost none of the ones who survived figured out what to do next, and the ones who did not figure it out still became dangerous, just not in the way they thought. One person needed to be stopped from escaping a planet, and Darth Malak's solution was to destroy the planet. The entire world and every person on it were gone, not because there was no other option, but because destruction was faster. Taris was a populated world, and the target was a single individual. Yet in the Legends game Knights of the Old Republic, Malak ordered the orbital strike without hesitation, accepting the complete loss of the planet as a reasonable price for preventing Bastila Shan's escape. The Warbringer is what an expendable looks like after they survive the Academy, but never outgrow its logic. They do not see power as leverage, patience, or positioning. They see it as the ability to end things, and they believe that ending things at greater scale means they're becoming stronger. For Malak, Bastila's escape was a tactical problem, and destroying the planet was him showing the galaxy what he could do in response. To him, the two were the same move, one just made louder than the other. The Warbringer does not want to win, they want to overwhelm. When a Sith stops seeing the difference between those two things, that confusion shapes every decision after. They read the silence around them as proof that the overwhelming is working, when what they're actually producing is distance. People comply because they're hoping the next demonstration lands on someone else, and they do it while quietly moving themselves further from the center. The Warbringer is power at its most insecure, still needing to keep proving what a more confident form of power would not have to prove at all. And the tradition keeps producing Warbringers, not by accident, but because the Sith Academy teaches dominance as the working definition of strength from the first day. Most students never untrain themselves out of that definition. When one of them becomes powerful enough to level a planet, what comes out is not a corrupted Sith, but the standard product of the curriculum at scale. The one thing a Sith at this tier cannot see coming is the threat that never announces itself as one. For months, no one at Korriban could point to what Githani was doing. Introduced in Path of Destruction, Githani operated inside an academy built to reward combat power, force strength, and physical dominance. She could fight, but she was not spending her energy there. She was building influence. Quietly, through conversations and alliances, the academy had no way to rank. By the time anyone understood what had happened, the outcome was already decided. The Warbringer cannot sit still, and the Phantom builds on that, specifically on the gap between what looks like nothing happening and what is actually being set up. But everything changed when a Phantom had to operate under the eye of someone trained to see exactly this kind of move. Darth Zana, whose story is the spine of Rule of Two, ran this at the highest possible level of difficulty. She was Darth Bane's apprentice, which meant she operated in daily proximity to one of the most powerful Sith alive, a man who knew, by design, that she would eventually move against him. Under the Rule of Two, that move was guaranteed, and Bane was watching for it. Zana lived inside that watch for years, and she made no mistakes. What concealment does to the person using it is the part that the Sith tradition almost never addressed. Performing loyalty every day to someone you're actively planning to kill is sustained psychological pressure, and most people would break under it. And the Phantom who succeeds does not just deceive their master, they get so good at concealment that the part of them still capable of being known starts to disappear. Not through any choice they made, but because concealment stopped being a skill they used and became the shape of the person using it. But the Phantom did not end with Zana. In Dynasty of Evil, the final volume of the trilogy, Darth Cognis added a quality the earlier Phantoms did not need: judgment under limited time. The lower version of Patience reacts to openings, but Cognis reacted only to the right opening, and that meant watching the wrong ones pass. Above this level, the goal is no longer to work within existing structures. What comes next does not maneuver inside a system, it tears the system down and builds a new one from the wreckage. Nagasado did not wait for a war, he built one from the ground up. From inside the Sith Empire's political structure, Sato, from the Tales of the Jedi comics, engineered the conditions that dragged the Republic and the Empire into open war. Not because war was going to happen on its own, but because he needed it to. He was not a soldier rising through a conflict, but the author of one, writing the script that the Sith Empire, the Republic, and his own rivals would all act out without knowing they had been cast. The Conqueror is the first tier where the Sith stops playing inside the game and starts writing it. At this tier, winning fights stops being the goal and redrawing the political order takes its place. The Conqueror can delegate a military campaign, an administrative region, a diplomatic mission, but what they cannot delegate is their own personal presence inside every decision that matters, and that presence is the only thing actually holding the Empire together. The moment a subordinate is allowed to make one of those decisions on their own, that subordinate becomes a competing source of authority. Sato hit that wall, and every Conqueror hits that wall. The difference between this tier and the Warbringer is not how they take territory, but the fact that they're trying to govern what they take. Taking territory proves force, but holding it requires structure, and while force is something a Conqueror always has in abundance, structure is something no single person can actually be, no matter how much of themselves they pour into the attempt. That is why Sato lost, and the war went with him. And one Sith had spent his entire life watching that happen, and he understood exactly why. The Sith Order Darth Bane inherited was not empty, and his answer was to burn it down. In the Darth Bane trilogy by Drew Karpyshyn, another Legends work, Bane arrived at a specific diagnosis. The Order had hundreds of practitioners competing with each other constantly for resources, influence, and standing, which meant it spent as much energy on itself as on the Jedi. The problem was not the people, but the structure. The architect is the Sith who stops asking how to win and starts asking what kind of structure would make victory inevitable later. Bane was not the first to watch the Old Order fail, but he was the first to draw the actual conclusion from watching. His answer would shape the next 1,000 years of galactic history. One master, one apprentice, and no more than that. Every generation, the Order's full power narrowed to 2 people. Passed forward through betrayal, built towards one final Sith, capable of what the army never was. Every architecture sacrifices something to survive, and Bane sacrificed more than the Sith usually admit. His design bought continuity, concentration, and discipline, and it paid for them with redundancy, institutional memory, and margin for error. The whole plan depends on every master choosing the right apprentice, every betrayal landing in favor of the stronger party, and no outside force wiping out the pair before the next one is ready. One bad pick, one unlucky encounter, one apprentice who moves too early or too late, and 1,000 years of work dies with them, with no second pair and no backup anywhere to carry it on. The plan worked, but that does not mean it was safe. It means the Sith got lucky for a long time, inside a system with no margin for being anything else. However, not every architect built through institutions. Something unprecedented was happening in parallel, and it did not need a throne to work. Darth Traya, central to Knights of the Old Republic 2, worked through people. She taught both Sith and Jedi, steering how those around her understood the nature of the Force itself. Her influence moved through individuals she had shaped, who went on to produce consequences she had already designed for long before they understood what was happening. The architect does not rule through armies, but through people you thought were your own, shaped long before you met them. All 5 of those tiers want something. The next shows what happens when that wanting is gone entirely. There was no plan, and by the time Darth Nihilus began moving, there was nothing left in him capable of forming one. In Knights of the Old Republic 2 and The Essential Guide to the Force, both legend sources, Nihilus consumed Force-sensitive life on a planetary scale, not in pursuit of any objective, but because consumption was the only mode his existence had left. Darth Sion arrived at the same place through a completely different path, depicted in the game as a figure held together past the point where his end should have come, not by biology, but by the dark side and the rage it ran through, with a body that was broken long ago and stayed that way. He did not choose to persist, he simply could not stop. The void is where Sith mastery pushes past the point where mastery remains possible. The Sith tradition defines itself through the practitioner being the one wielding the dark side, and the void is what the practitioner becomes when that relationship inverts. Nihilus is the hunger, and Sion is the pain. And in both cases, the practitioner is no longer using the dark side at all, because the dark side is using what is left of them. Yet the power this produces is far more limited than it appears. Nihilus could drain entire populations, but he could also be countered by someone who understood what he was. Sion could not be stopped through ordinary means, but he was not invulnerable to the right kind of resistance. Neither could be given objectives or relied upon to produce a predictable outcome. They were the most powerful things in any room they entered, and the room could do nothing with them. The Sith Order did not change its doctrine after seeing this, and the real question is, why? One explanation is arrogance, a belief that Nihilus and Sion were outliers rather than proof the whole system could break. Another is that the Order saw them as useful, even so, weapons that cannot be controlled, but could still be pointed at an enemy at least once. The structural answer is harder to avoid. After Bane, the Rule of Two left the Sith with no council, no archive, and no collective body to review what had gone wrong. Just 2 people, at any given time, with their own goals and their own reasons not to ask questions that might slow them down. Institutional memory requires an institution, and the Sith, by their own design, no longer had one. So the lesson was never drawn, and the same pattern came back in the final generation of the Order. Mastery collapsing into the thing the practitioner was trying to control inside Vader, inside the relationship between Vader and Sidious, inside the belief that the dark side could be held by 2 people and directed cleanly across a galaxy. The Sith stopped being able to learn from themselves long before they stopped winning. That silence is not accidental, it is the most revealing thing the Order ever did. But the void was not the only answer to the problem of mastery pushed past its limits. There was one more, and it crossed the same threshold without losing control on the way out. Mark Aragnos chose for a century, holding back every rival, every challenge, every moment someone else calculated whether the time was right, but then he died. The succession crisis that erupted the moment he was gone showed what his presence had actually been doing. The conflict between Nagasato and Ludo Kresh, depicted in the Tales of the Jedi comics, was not a power vacuum, but proof that every rival capable of moving against him had spent a century calculating whether the moment was right. When he was gone, that calculation vanished with him, and what followed escalated directly into the Great Hyperspace War. Further back still, Ajuntapal predates Ragnos by thousands of years, the first Dark Lord of the Sith in the Legends timeline. By the time of Knights of the Old Republic, thousands of years after his death, his spirit still occupied his tomb on Korriban, not as a historical record, but as a continued presence, still there for anyone willing to seek him out. And what came after him would not wait to be found, it went looking. Vitiate, also known as Valkorion in Star Wars The Old Republic, is the full expression of this tier, his influence spanning roughly 15 centuries of active manipulation across the galaxy. His first major ritual consumed the life of an entire planet. He built the Sith Empire that defined the Old Republic era, then watched every comparable figure around him fall until he was the last one standing. He moved across bodies, identities, centuries, not a leftover waiting to be found, but something still operating. The Eternal is the Sith who does not just outlive death, but who keeps choosing across spans of time that should dissolve identity. And the question at this tier is not how that is possible, but what it erases. Every century Vitiate lives through is a century of loss. The people he used to know die, the institutions he helped build get replaced, languages shift, and apprentices rise and are discarded before the next generation begins. What that does to a person is not dramatic, it is quiet. A person is partly held in place by the people who know them, and when those people are gone long enough, the parts of the self that relied on them go too. The version of him that existed before the ritual on his home world is separated from him now by too many centuries and too many bodies to still feel like his own, and functionally, it is someone else's life he is remembering. He still makes decisions, but he makes them as the thing that is left after everything that could anchor him was outlived. Survival is not the power, but what the power costs, paid in pieces of the person who started. One mistake across that time frame would have reset everything to zero, and he never made one. That is what puts him at this tier, but the harder question is what it got him in return. After 15 centuries of that, the unsettling thing is not the power, but that something is still choosing. The dark side did not pull these practitioners in the same direction. It amplified whatever was already there. 7 tiers of ancient Sith covered everything from disposable students to beings who outlived empires. Darth Maul was a Sith from a different era entirely, built for a galaxy where the Sith had been extinct for nearly 1,000 years. If you put him in the Old Republic, he would not have stayed Maul for long. Darth Maul killed a Jedi Master in single combat, survived being cut in half on pure rage, built a criminal empire, seized an entire planet, and kept fighting until the very end. When people imagine Maul in the Old Republic, they imagine domination. But the Old Republic is not the era Maul was built for. The Old Republic is a galaxy at war, and the Sith are everywhere. Using both canon and legend sources, each chapter removes one advantage Maul had in the prequel era: his rarity, his training edge, his combat surprise, his independence, and measures what is left when the Old Republic strips all of it away. Chapter 1: A Galaxy of Sith. The Old Republic is nothing like the galaxy from which Maul comes, because the single biggest advantage he had in the prequel era was not his speed or his lightsaber, it was that he was the only one. The era stretches back thousands of years, but 3 conflicts define it: the Great Sith War, the Jedi Civil War, and the Great Galactic War, which ended with the Treaty of Coruscant and gave way to a Cold War that never really ended. These events come from legend sources, but they all point to the same reality. The Sith were not hiding, they were running half the galaxy. They are a rival galactic government with their own military, their own territory, their own capital Andromen Kos, and their own ruling body, the Dark Council. 12 of the most powerful Sith Lords in the galaxy sit on that council, and above them all is the Sith Emperor. Below them are thousands more. Sith academies on Korriban churn out new acolytes in waves. Every generation produces new warriors, sorcerers, and Sith Lords, climbing the ranks over the bodies of those who came before them. This is not a galaxy with just 2 Sith, but one filled with thousands of them, and the Sith command vast infrastructure, including star destroyers, ground armies, and intelligence networks. Entire planets answer to individual Darths the way prequel-era systems answer to senators. A Sith Lord in this era is a warlord with resources. He has apprentices who would kill for his position, allies who would betray him for the right offer, and enemies who are plotting against him at this very moment. Power in this era is not something you seize once, it is something you defend every single day. In Legends, the Force itself is used very differently. Sith sorcery, battle meditation, alchemy, and ritual warfare are standard tools of war, not rare relics. What the prequel-era Jedi study as ancient history, the Old Republic Sith deploy on the battlefield every day. Meanwhile, in The Phantom Menace, Ki-Adi-Mundi states that the Sith have been extinct for nearly a millennium. In Maul's era, the appearance of a Sith was so historic that the Jedi Council debated whether it was even possible. Chapter 2: Built Only to Kill. With the Old Republic established, the next step is to look at Maul himself, not the exaggerated version from Versus debates, but the real Maul, what he can actually do, what he cannot do, and why that distinction matters. In canon, Maul was taken from Dathomir as a child by Darth Sidious and trained from youth as an assassin. His entire education was physical and martial. He learned to fight, to kill, to endure pain, and to hate. He did not learn Sith philosophy, study galactic politics, or explore the deeper Force traditions the Sith had carried for millennia. Sidious did this on purpose. Maul was never meant to be a successor. He was a tool, a blade that Sidious pointed at problems until the blade broke. When Maul fell on Naboo, Sidious replaced him with Count Dooku almost immediately. That tells you everything about how Sidious viewed him. The duel with Qui-Gon Jinn on Naboo reveals both Maul's ceiling and his floor. His lightsaber skills are real. He fights with extraordinary speed and aggression, using a double-bladed lightsaber to overwhelm opponents through relentless pressure. His primary form, identified in legend sources like Jedi vs. Sith, The Essential Guide to the Force, is Juyo, Form 7, the most aggressive of the 7 classical lightsaber forms. His Force abilities are functional but limited, focus mainly on telekinesis, enhanced speed and reflexes, and basic dark side augmentation. In all of his canon appearances, The Phantom Menace, The Clone Wars, Rebels, he never demonstrates sorcery, alchemy, force drain, or any advanced dark side technique. He hits things with the Force, and he hits things with his lightsaber. That is his range. After his return in the Clone Wars, Maul does show growth. He builds a crime syndicate, manipulates Mandalorian politics, and seizes control of an entire planet. That is impressive by prequel-era standards, but his political instincts are still crude compared to the people he's competing against. Sidious dismantles his entire operation in a single visit, not because Maul is stupid, but because Maul is playing a local game and Sidious is playing a galactic one. In Legends, the novel Shadowhunter and the Darth Maul comic series reinforce this profile. He is an assassin trained for stealth kills and direct combat. The novel Darth Plagueis confirms that Sidious deliberately limited Maul's education. He knows almost nothing about Sith history, philosophy, or lore compared to what any Sith in the Old Republic would consider basic knowledge. Sidious did not build a successor, he built a weapon. Chapter 3: Lords of the Dark Side. The gap between Maul and the Sith of this era is not a matter of degree, but a matter of kind. Starting at the bottom, students at the Korriban Academy learn to drain the life energy from living beings, study rituals that bind spirits, and practice alchemy that warps living creatures into weapons. Sith Inquisitors take it further. Force drain, binding Force ghosts to their will, ritual magic that has no equivalent in Maul's experience. A Sith acolyte on Korriban might learn more about the dark side in their first year than Maul learned in his entire life under Sidious. He has never encountered any of this and has no defense against capabilities he does not know exist. That is the floor, but the ceiling is far worse. The Sith Lords who lead this era are not just fighters, they're warlords, scholars, and architects of the Empire. Darth Malgus, the Sith who sacked the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, combines raw martial power with military command and ideological vision. He did not rise through dueling alone. He led armies, broke sieges, and understood that in the Sith Empire, power is measured by territory and influence, not kill counts. Darth Naga Sadow wielded Sith sorcery powerful enough to manipulate stars. Darth Revan, during his time as a Sith Lord, combined lightsaber mastery with deep Force knowledge and strategic brilliance that reshaped the galaxy twice, once as a conqueror and once as a redeemer. Every one of them would look at Maul and see raw talent with no infrastructure behind it. In this era, a Sith Lord's responsibilities extend far beyond the battlefield. Territory, sometimes an entire planet or system that generates revenue, produces soldiers, and serves as a base of operations. A network of spies who report on rival Sith movements. A cadre of apprentices who are both useful and dangerous. Military assets that must be maintained, deployed, and protected from both the Republic and from other Sith who want them. Above the Sith Lords sits the Dark Council. Rank at that level requires political alliances, knowledge of Sith rituals, control of military assets, and the ability to scheme across years. A Dark Council member might never ignite a lightsaber in a given year, and still destroy 3 rivals before the season ends. All of this while navigating internal politics, where a single misstep can cost you everything overnight. And above even the Dark Council is the Emperor. Vitiate performed the Anathema ritual, stripping an entire world of all life, and used that energy to make himself functionally immortal for over 1,000 years. Maul would be irrelevant to someone operating at that scale. Maul's combat ability would place him among the Sith warriors or even Sith lords. Chapter 4. No More Surprise. When Qui-Gon Jinn encountered Maul on Tatooine, he was genuinely caught off guard. In the Old Republic, encounters with Sith are routine. Qui-Gon Jinn had never fought one. Jedi like Satele Shan had faced them many times. Old Republic Jedi are combat veterans, and fighting Sith is part of their standard training. Every Jedi Knight in this era has fought or trained extensively to fight opponents who use rage, fear, and the dark side to fuel their attacks. Revan defeated Mandalore the Ultimate and multiple Sith Lords. Mitra Surik, the Jedi Exile, killed 3 Sith Lords in sequence. Bastila Shan's battle meditation could shift the outcome of entire fleet engagements. Satele Shan held her own against a powerful Sith Lord in combat while she was still a Padawan, as depicted in the Old Republic cinematic trailers. These are Jedi who have been burned by the dark side, lost people to it, and walked into rooms knowing a Sith was on the other side of the door. They do not freeze when they see a red blade. They do not hesitate, and this is where Maul's specific fighting style becomes a liability rather than an edge. His primary form, Juyo, Form 7, channels emotion, particularly rage, into unpredictable, overwhelming offense. In the prequel era, the Jedi Council restricts access to it. Almost no Jedi practice it. The only known master of a Form 7 variant among the prequel Jedi is Mace Windu, whose Vapad is a refined, light side compatible version that channels an opponent's dark energy back at them. When Maul attacks with Juyo, most prequel-era Jedi are facing something they have never trained against. They do not know its rhythms, where the openings are, or that surviving the first 30 seconds is the entire strategy. In the Old Republic, rage-driven combat is common. Sith warriors and Sith marauders use rage-fuel aggressive lightsaber combat as their baseline approach. The Knights of the Old Republic games reflect this directly. The Sith Marauder Prestige class is built entirely around channeling aggression into lightsaber combat. Old Republic Jedi have trained against it thousands of times. They know that a Juyo user burns energy quickly, that the aggression follows a tempo where the second wave weakens if the first is survived, and that the form leaves openings in the moments between strikes when the user is committed and cannot redirect. Everything Maul relies on to overwhelm an opponent they have already seen and already beaten. The forms that counter Juyo most effectively, Suresu, the defensive endurance form, and Gemso, which redirect power attacks, are also widely practiced in this era. His double-bladed lightsaber compounds the problem. In the prequel era, it is a psychological weapon because no one expects it. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan are visibly thrown by it. In the Old Republic, double-bladed lightsabers and dual wielding are common among both Sith and Jedi. Sith Marauders and Jedi Sentinels are standard combat archetypes. Maul could still defeat many individual Jedi Knights and some Jedi Masters. His speed and ferocity are real, and his mastery of Juyo is genuine. But the tactical surprise, the chaos, the shock, the sense that the fight is spiraling out of control is gone. Maul does not become a bad fighter in this era, he becomes a predictable one. And for someone whose entire identity is built on being the most dangerous person in the room, being predictable is a death sentence. But the Old Republic does not even need to beat Maul in a fight to destroy him. Chapter 5. Death by Politics. The most likely thing that kills Maul in the Old Republic is not a lightsaber, but politics. Apprentices assassinate masters to take their place, Dark Council members sabotage rivals through intelligence operations, military maneuvering, and proxy wars that never require them to personally draw a weapon. Maul has no power base. He arrives with no allies, no fleet, no territory, no intelligence network, and no understanding of the Empire's political structure. In the prequel era, Sidious provides all of that infrastructure. Maul does not need to think about logistics or alliances because Sidious handles everything. In the Old Republic, he would have to build it himself, and he has no training in how to do so. The methods of destruction in this era are sophisticated. A rival does not need to challenge Maul openly. They can reroute his supply shipments, plant false intelligence that sends him into a Republic ambush, bribe his subordinates who, in the Sith Empire, are often loyal only to the highest bidder, leak his location to the Jedi and frame it as an accident, petition the Dark Council to reassign his territory to a more capable lord, or tie his name to a failed campaign and let the Empire's own bureaucracy do the rest. By the time Maul realizes what is happening, his power base is gone, and he's standing alone in a room full of people who were never his allies to begin with. The most likely scenario plays out like this. A Sith Lord or Darth recognizes Maul's combat value and takes him on as an enforcer, and Maul does what he does best. He kills, clearing out rival strongholds, eliminating Jedi strike teams, and being the first through the door and the last one standing when the dust settles. His master advances, and Maul is rewarded with a title, a small territory, maybe a ship, and a handful of soldiers. And then, the moment he becomes inconvenient or shows a flicker of ambition, his master disposes of him, poisons his supply lines, sends him into an ambush, feeds the location to the Jedi. It happens fast and quietly. One day Maul has a place in the hierarchy, the next day he is an asset that has been written off. This is the standard life cycle of an enforcer in the Sith Empire. The Star Wars The Old Republic storylines are full of them. Powerful warriors who serve their masters faithfully, accomplish everything asked of them, and were discarded the moment their ambition outgrew their usefulness. The Sith Empire treats loyalty as a temporary arrangement and violence as a renewable resource. There's always another killer waiting behind you. In the Old Republic, Maul's role does not change, only his handler does. If Maul tries to rise independently, the situation only gets worse, because he would draw the attention of the Dark Council, or the Emperor's personal enforcers, the Emperor's Wrath, or the Emperor's Hand. These are individuals selected for both extreme combat ability and absolute loyalty to the power structure. They exist specifically to eliminate threats like Maul, skilled, ambitious Sith who operate outside the hierarchy. The Sith who killed the most people in the Old Republic era never swung a blade. They signed orders, and Maul does not know how to read the orders before they are signed against him. Chapter 6: One Sith Among Thousands. Every advantage that made Maul exceptional in the prequel era does not exist here. If he is dropped in as he exists in The Phantom Menace before Growth, before Mandalore, before any of it, he most likely dies within a few years. Not because he's weak. He is one of the most dangerous individual combatants of his era. But the Old Republic does not run on individual combat. It runs on networks, alliances, fleets, and betrayal. Maul is a blade in a world that kills with paperwork. His combat skills keep him alive in the short term. He can defeat a random Sith warrior in the halls of the Academy, and probably a Jedi Knight on the frontier too. But the fights do not happen in a vacuum. Every duel he wins makes him visible. Every kill creates enemies among the dead person's allies. And in the Sith Empire, being visible without being protected is the fastest way to die. The political machinery grinds forward. Somewhere, a Darth signs an order. Somewhere, a supply line goes dark. Somewhere, Maul walks into a room that was supposed to be safe and finds out it never was. The most honest answer to this video's question is the cold drop scenario, and in that version, the Old Republic eats him alive. But dismissing Maul entirely would be dishonest. He is not a static character. By the time of Rebels, he independently studies holocrons, manipulates a Force-sensitive teenager, and executes long-term schemes with no support network. He does learn. So if he were placed into the Sith Empire young, this is hypothetical, not drawn from any official source, and given access to Sith education, political exposure, and decades to grow, the best case scenario is a mid-tier Darth, one who holds a regional power base, commands respect, and remains dangerous. But he is not reshaping the galaxy, sitting on the Dark Council, or challenging the Emperor. Even in the best case, the ceiling is real. Revan studied the deep mysteries of the Force and led a galactic revolution. Bane tore down the entire Sith Order and rebuilt it from nothing. Vitiate consumed a world and ruled for a millennium. These are fundamentally different kinds of Sith thinkers, architects, visionaries. Maul is none of those things. He is a doer, a killer, and a blade. And that is the answer that stays the same no matter what era you put him in. Maul was built to be a weapon, not a leader. In the prequel era, that limitation is hidden because Sidious does the thinking for him. In the Old Republic, there is no one for Maul to hide behind. No master managing his career, and no grand plan giving his violence a purpose. Just the raw machinery of an empire that has processed 1,000 fighters exactly like him, and will process 1,000 more after he's gone. The galaxy does not bend to his will, it absorbs him. One more dangerous Sith among thousands, burning bright and burning out. In any era, Maul is exactly what Sidious made him sharp enough to cut, but never sharp enough to rule. Maul's identity was built around a lightsaber. The ancient Sith he would have walked into would have looked at that weapon and called it a Jedi tool. For over 2,000 years, the Sith Empire fought without lightsabers, and the reasons they refused them go deeper than equipment.
For over 2,000 years, the ancient Sith Empire dominated its region of the galaxy without using lightsabers. While Jedi wielded energy blades across the Republic, Sith Lords fought with alchemical swords, forged in blood and rage, actively refusing the weapon that would later define them. This was not ignorance or poverty. Something about the lightsaber itself conflicted with what it meant to be Sith. The legend sources reveal 7 specific reasons why almost all ancient Sith refused lightsabers, making the weapon's eventual adoption a compromise rather than an evolution of their thinking. The first reason is foundational. Lightsabers violated early Sith philosophy about power and passion. In Legends continuity, specifically the Star Wars Book of Sith by Daniel Wallace, the Sith Code establishes their core belief system. The Code teaches that peace is a lie, and only passion leads to true power. In contrast, the Jedi Code confines its followers through peace, serenity, and harmony, which the Sith saw as the passive acceptance of limitations. Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hatred leads to power, and power leads to victory. Rage channeled through anger is unstoppable, and passion will always defeat peace. For the Sith, the lightsaber represented everything wrong with Jedi philosophy. The weapon embodied restraint and control, the very limitations the Sith rejected. To adopt it would mean accepting Jedi assumptions about power itself. The second reason reveals what Sith weapons actually were, extensions of the wielder's dark side essence created through blood ritual. According to legend sources, a Sith sword is enhanced by submerging it in a trough of blood spilled in anger, with its edge ground using Spholten rhyolite to ensure it never dulls. The Sith species themselves had practiced this sword forging tradition for millennia before the Dark Jedi ever arrived on Korriban. When the exiled Dark Jedi became Sith Lords, they adopted and refined these existing methods rather than clinging to their Jedi weapons. Sith alchemy worked on both living and non-living matter, though metal was easier for apprentices to work with because there was no living cells to resist the change. According to Sources Sin, one of the first Dark Lords who chronicled these techniques, the process was not quick or simple. Creating a Sith sword required time, rage, and sacrifice. Once altered, any object touched with alchemical science would become force-sensitive itself, forever retaining a mirror imprint of its forger. The weapon carried an echo of the Sith's dark side presence even after death. This meant that wielding a Sith sword was wielding a piece of its creator's power preserved in metal. The blade also focuses the force energy of the user, giving the edge an unnatural sharpness. As the wielder grows stronger in the dark side, the blade becomes more deadly in response. The weapon adapts to its master's growth, which created a bond that went far beyond simple ownership. Warrior and weapon were connected through the Force itself, linked by the blood and rage that forged the blade. Sith swords were not just tools, but literal extensions of their maker's power. A lightsaber, by contrast, could be picked up and used by anyone with the skill to wield it. It carried no imprint of its creator, no bond with its user, and it did not grow stronger as the wielder grew stronger. It was simply a tool, efficient and effective, but ultimately lifeless. For the Sith, this made it inferior, no matter how effective it might be in combat. A weapon without connection was a weapon without meaning. The third reason exposes a philosophical divide. Lightsabers removed the physical reality of violence that the Sith valued. Legend sources preserve a statement from Comac Da, a Sith from this era, that reveals this mindset. For him, although lightsabers are a superior weapon, there is nothing quite as satisfying as feeling the warm spray of blood when one cuts through an enemy with a metal sword. The Sith wanted to experience combat fully, not at a sanitized distance. The lightsaber's energy blade killed without physical contact, without texture, without the feel of steel cutting through flesh. For a tradition built on channeling passion, rage, and anger into power, this distance went against everything they believed. The fourth reason reveals a technological reality. Early lightsabers were deeply flawed weapons during the era when the Sith Empire was founded. The earliest lightsabers were crude devices that used experimental frozen blaster technology to create an energy beam of a fixed length. Designed mainly for siege warfare, these archaic lightsabers were barely portable. Their energy needs required a flexible cable connecting the lightsaber's handle to a power pack worn on a Jedi's belt. The cable was not shielded and literally tied a Jedi to the lightsaber, creating an obvious weakness in personal combat. These weapons, sometimes called proto-sabers, were not practical for the kind of fighting the Sith valued. Movement was severely restricted by the tether. The cable itself could be cut by an opponent, instantly disabling the weapon. The power pack strapped to the user's belt became a vulnerable target. An enemy could destroy it, deplete it, or simply force prolonged combat until the energy cell ran dry. For warriors who relied on aggressive, close-quarters combat channeling dark-side rage, these limitations were unacceptable. The timeline makes this even clearer. During the 100-year darkness around 7000 BBY, when the Dark Jedi were defeated and exiled, lightsabers had improved somewhat, but each still required a plug-in power pack attached to the user's belt. This was the state of the technology when those exiles discovered the Sith species and founded the Sith Empire. Their descendants did not use lightsabers during the Great Hyperspace War approximately 2,000 years later, choosing instead to invest in the alchemical weapons they saw as superior to what the Republic possessed. Throughout nearly the entire Golden Age, lightsabers remained technologically inferior to Sith swords. Even when Sith engineers developed internal power cells during the Great Hyperspace War itself, solving the proto-saber's fatal flaws, the Sith forces continued wielding their traditional blades in battle. The weapon they were refusing was no longer technologically inferior, yet they refused it still. This reveals that their choice had always been cultural rather than practical. The fifth reason demonstrates practical superiority. Sith swords were more effective in combat than early lightsabers. The combat advantages were clear. Sith swords are effective against lightsabers because their alchemically altered metal refracts the lightsaber's energy while retaining rigidity and sharpness. A lightsaber cuts through ordinary metal easily, but a Sith sword's alchemical properties allow it to interact with the energy rather than being destroyed. Unlike ancient lightsabers, Sith swords require no power packs or energy cells. This gave them a major advantage in sustained combat. They could deflect blaster bolts just as easily as lightsabers while having no technological weaknesses to exploit. With no cables or power cells, the weapon was always ready at full strength. Darkside wielders could also channel their force power directly into the weapon itself. When calling upon the dark side, they could add that power to the sword's damage, rather than just their accuracy. This increased the blade's killing power in ways impossible with early lightsabers. When wielded by a trained Sith warrior, a Sith sword was often a match for a lightsaber in single combat. The weapon's effectiveness was never in question. The later shift to lightsabers came from different factors entirely. The sixth reason exposes a historical reality. War eventually forced compromise on even deeply held traditions. In the legend source Star Wars: The Essential Atlas by Jason Fry and Daniel Wallace, it documents the Great Hyperspace War in 5000 BBY with specific details about the weapons used. Republic defenders struggled against strange invaders who wielded weapons of alien design. When Sith forces reached Coruscant's legislative district, Jedi defenders stood shoulder to shoulder with lightsabers drawn as a last line of defense. The contrast was clear. Sith wielded traditional weapons while Jedi used lightsabers. The Sith had built an interstellar empire with advanced starships, alchemy, and sophisticated force techniques. Yet, they chose traditional arms because those weapons reflected their values in ways technology could not. Visual records from Star Wars: Tales of the Jedi comics by Kevin J. Anderson provide direct confirmation of this weapon choice. In the Golden Age of the Sith, Issue 2, Sith Lords Naga Sadow and Ludo Kresh are shown wielding traditional metal swords during their succession duel around 5000 BBY. These were the two most powerful Sith competing for supremacy after the previous Dark Lord's death. At the highest level of their civilization, during a formal challenge for ultimate power, they wielded traditional Sith swords wreathed in darkside energy. In The Fall of the Sith Empire Issues 3 and 4, battle scenes from the Great Hyperspace War show Sith ground troops and Massassi warriors armed with swords, axes, and polearms fighting against Jedi with blue lightsabers. The visual contrast appears repeatedly throughout the invasion. The first recorded Sith to use a lightsaber was not a traditional Sith at all. The earliest record of a Sith using a lightsaber was Freedon Nad, a former Jedi apprentice who learned the ways of the Sith from the spirit of Naga Sadow. This occurred around 4400 BBY, approximately 400 years after Sadow's death during the Great Hyperspace War. The timeline is significant. For over a millennium after their civilization fell, no Sith had adopted the lightsaber. Nad was a fallen Jedi who brought his weapon when he turned to the dark side. When he awakened Sadow's spirit on Yavin 4 and learned Sith sorcery, there is no record of lightsaber instruction. The ancient Dark Lord taught traditional Sith methods even to a student who already knew how to wield a lightsaber. Sadow chose to preserve the old ways rather than adapt to what his student brought. More than 300 years later, Exar Kun modified his own lightsaber into a double-bladed weapon by following instructions from a Sith holocron. The knowledge existed in Sith archives, but was not actively practiced. Lightsaber adoption came from outside Sith culture, imported by Jedi defectors rather than developed from within. The seventh reason reveals persistence. Traditional weapons remained dominant throughout the Sith Empire's existence. Sith swords remained the weapon of choice from the Empire's founding to its fall. This was not a slow transition or gradual acceptance of lightsabers. The ancient Sith maintained their weapon traditions consistently across their entire civilization, only abandoning them when the Empire itself collapsed. The archaeological and historical record shows no period of mixed use, no gradual shift in preference. It was a total commitment to their alchemical blades until the civilization that created them ceased to exist. Even in later eras, after lightsabers had become common among Sith, the old weapon traditions were remembered as more than just relics. They represented a different understanding of what it meant to wield the dark side, a connection to power that later Sith had lost or abandoned. Understanding this choice requires seeing past efficiency. The contrast between these two weapons reveals everything about the ancient Sith worldview. The ancient Sith operated from a worldview their descendants would not share. For them, the weapon's creation through blood ritual was inseparable from its power. Later Sith would adopt different methods, not because they had forgotten, but because they served different purposes in different times. However, for 2,000 years, this weapon tradition held. It defined what it meant to be Sith during the Golden Age, before fallen Jedi brought their lightsabers into the culture. The philosophical conflicts between tradition and adaptation would continue shaping every generation that followed.
Every Sith tradition Every blade, every ritual, every doctrine the ancient Sith produced came from one planet. Korriban was the home world of the original Sith species, and the dark side energy stored in its ground had been compounding for tens of thousands of years before the first Dark Lord ever set foot on it. The most powerful Jedi Master alive nearly broke when he walked across it. Chapter 1. Before the Sith. The red dust of Korriban has been settling over the bones of the fallen for longer than most civilizations have existed. Before anyone built the first tomb, before anyone carved the first name into stone, this planet was already wrong. Barren canyon walls stripped of nearly all life, a sky the light never quite breaks through, and silence where there should be wind. The landscape does not just look empty, it looks used. To understand why Yoda's visit nearly broke him, you have to understand what was already in the ground when he landed. The Force clings to places where suffering and ritual have built up over long stretches of time. The cave on Dagobah, where Luke Skywalker confronted his own doubts, is one small example. A place where dark side energy concentrated to an unusual degree. Most places like that are contained to a single cave or chamber. Korriban is not a single dark spot, it is the whole planet. Even the earliest legend sources, which carry most of this history, only scratch the surface of what was building here. Much of the planet's earliest history comes from those legends' accounts. Long before any civilization claimed this world, Korriban was already radiating dark side energy strong enough to register from the far side of the galaxy. Ancient empires that existed long before the Sith recognized that power and marked the planet as significant. Those empires eventually collapsed. Korriban kept pulling, and yet, the Dark Lords did not create the corruption rooted in this world. They inherited it. The species that evolved here, a red-skinned people known simply as the Sith, were Force-sensitive from the beginning, and their culture, shaped by centuries of isolation on a world already leaning toward the shadow of the Force, was built around dark side traditions from the start. They practiced alchemy and blood sacrifice, and their burial sites were not cultural decoration, but structures built to serve a specific function. The tombs they carved were sealed chambers designed to store dark side energy, trap the essence of the departed inside the walls, and channel the life force of sacrificed servants into the stone itself. Every tomb worked like a battery, a contained system that built up dark side power and released it slowly into the surrounding landscape over centuries. The more powerful the individual laid to rest inside, the more concentrated the energy stored within the walls, and they never stopped building them. Unlike a scar left by a single battle, the weight pressing down on Korriban does not fade at any point in its recorded history. It compounds, growing heavier with every tomb added to the landscape. Each generation inherited a world more saturated than the one before, and left it heavier still. The planet cycled through periods of habitation and abandonment, but even when its surface lay empty for centuries, the tombs kept working. The energy stored in the walls did not need living caretakers. It sustained itself, drawing from the suffering sealed inside, and releasing it slowly into the surrounding ground. By the time outside forces arrived, the species had been layering this power into the rock for millennia. The world was loaded beyond anything they fully understood. Even then, the people who would push Korriban past the breaking point had already lost a war, and they were already looking for somewhere to land. Chapter 2. The Exiled Jedi. The struggle that produced the Sith tradition did not begin in Korriban. It began inside the Jedi Order. The Legends timeline carries the fullest account of what happened next. A faction of Jedi had turned toward the dark side. Practicing forms of alchemy and Force manipulation the Order had long forbidden. After a prolonged conflict later called the 100-Year Darkness, the Order defeated them. The question of what came next would define the galaxy for longer than anyone alive at the time could have imagined. The victors faced a choice that would echo through galactic history longer than almost any other single decision. They could carry out final judgment on the defeated Darksiders. They could imprison them with no end in sight, or they could exile them, sending them beyond Republic space and letting distance do what Force of Arms had not finished. The Jedi chose exile. Their philosophy demanded compassion, and a mass execution was incompatible with what the Order believed itself to stand for. The defeated faction, led by a man named Ajunta Pall, was stripped of weapons and cast into uncharted space, and what they found would reshape the galaxy for 25,000 years. They found Korriban, and what followed was not simply a conquest, but a fusion, and the thing it produced was more formidable than either side could have created alone. The Sith tradition was born from that exchange. Ajunta Pall and his followers arrived on a world inhabited by Force-sensitive people who had been practicing dark side traditions longer than the Jedi Order had existed. The exiles conquered them by force, but the deeper exchange ran in both directions. The exiles brought advanced knowledge of the Force, techniques, and depth of understanding the native species had never developed. In return, the original inhabitants offered centuries of refined burial craft, deep ritual knowledge rooted in their specific environment, and a working relationship with a planet that was itself a reservoir of dark side power. Together on a world already saturated with that energy, they built something the galaxy had never seen before, a civilization where the Force itself was engineered into the landscape. The consequences would outlast every person involved by millennia. The Jedi Order that made exile possible would spend the rest of its existence dealing with what that mercy produced. The Valley of the Dark Lords began to take shape during this period, carved through the landscape as a deep corridor lined with tomb entrances and flanked by towering statues of the lords who rested inside. With every generation, the valley grew larger and heavier. Each new lord demanded a burial grander than the last, and the corridor stretched deeper into the canyon with every addition. What had started as a burial ground was becoming something else entirely, a seat of authority that outlasted every individual who contributed to it. Even so, the man who started it all could not escape what his creation became. Ajunta Pall, the first Dark Lord, was eventually entombed in the same stone that he had helped shape. The Legends novel Revan reveals that when visitors found his tomb millennia later, the presence waiting inside was not triumphant. It was full of regret, one of the only Dark Lords in the entire historical record to express anything resembling remorse from beyond the grave. The man who had started everything wished he could take it back. The valley did not care. It fed on the regret the same way it fed on any other suffering sealed into its walls. The tradition Pall founded would outlast him by millennia, and the valley it filled would grow into the most feared corridor in the galaxy, the same corridor Yoda would one day walk alone. Chapter 3: Valley of Lords. As the centuries passed, the Valley of the Dark Lords grew into something no other place in the galaxy could match. Red rock and sand stretched between the monuments, and the air itself felt heavier the deeper anyone walked. The valley worked like a resonance chamber, the same way a cathedral amplifies sound by shaping how waves interact in a shared space. Each burial strengthened the next, and the combined effect of dozens of tombs radiating at once produced a surrounding weight far more powerful than any single burial could generate on its own. With every new tomb added to the system, the chamber grew louder. The air itself carried the charge. The lords did not build their tombs as memorials. They built them as instruments. They filled burial chambers with weapons, encrypted knowledge, ritual constructs, and traps designed to kill. Through ceremonies refined over generations, they sealed their essences into the tomb walls, preserving their awareness long after death. The more lethal a tomb, the more famous its occupant became. The more famous the occupant, the more ambitious seekers came to attempt the challenges within. Anyone who entered the valley was tested. Anyone who tested was changed. No one walked through the valley the same person they were when they walked in. In death, the Lords of the Valley became a governing body of the departed, still conducting examinations and still passing judgments centuries after their time had ended. Among the most discussed was Tulak Hord, whose combined mastery of lightsaber combat and raw force power made his reputation one of the most enduring in the history of the Ancient Order. Accounts describing ending duels before they truly began, moving with a speed and precision that left opponents certain the outcome was already decided. His command of the Force was no less direct. draining the will from entire groups before a blade was ever drawn. He sealed the essence of his own servant inside his tomb, so the man's torment would continue as a permanent offering long after both of them were gone. Nagasato's ambitions reached far enough to spark a full-scale offensive against the Republic, and his burial chamber contained objects so volatile that trained practitioners did not enter it casually even centuries later. Still, no figure showed how the valley truly worked more clearly than Mark Aragnos. He ruled for a century, and when he fell, his presence appeared at the entrance to his tomb to judge which of his rivals deserved to succeed him. Even in death, Ragnos was still setting the terms. Two lords, Nagasato and Ludo Kresh, stood before that apparition and competed for the title. The contest was not resolved cleanly. Their rivalry tore the Empire apart and drove Sato to launch a campaign against the Republic, believing that conquest would settle the question of power Ragnos had left open. The Republic crushed that offensive and then struck back with a retaliation campaign that hit the ancient worlds from orbit, scattered populations, and targeted the temples the Order had built over generations. One fallen lord had judged two living ones. Two living ones had torn an empire apart. Apparitions rising from burial chambers to confront the living, visions designed to test and manipulate, all of it still running when Yoda walked into the valley millennia later. The dead were still setting the galaxy on fire from inside their tombs. Other dark side worlds exist, but none of them work the way Korriban does. As shown in Rebels, Malachor is a shattered world, its surface littered with the remains of warriors frozen in the moment of their final stand. The power there is real and intense, but it has a fixed character sealed in place by a single devastating event. Malachor stopped developing the instant that event ended. Every other darkside world in the galaxy shares some version of the same limitation: power that is either frozen in place, tied to a single culture, or dependent on infrastructure that someone could locate and dismantle. Korriban does not stay in one place. It reaches out, draws force-sensitive people from vast distances, and either breaks them or sends them back into the galaxy carrying its influence. It does not wait for visitors, it calls to them, and the system that built this engine had been refining itself for longer than most galactic governments had existed. Chapter 4: The Sith Machine. A young man arrived in Korriban with nothing but ability and anger. No title, no lineage, no recognized claim to anything. By the time he left, he had become the single most important figure in the history of the Ancient Order, the architect of a 1,000-year plan that ended with the fall of the Jedi Order and the rise of the Galactic Empire. The Legends novel Path of Destruction tells his story. His name was Bane, and what happened to him is the clearest record of what Korriban's system actually does to the people who walk into it. The first layer of that process is the planet functioning as political ground. Every major darkside regime in galactic history returned to Korriban, not out of tradition for its own sake, but because controlling the planet sent a signal with real consequences in a galaxy where the Force is physically felt. A lord who held Korriban gained direct access to a planetary well of darkside energy that rivals could sense from an entire region away. Empires that control this world projected an authority that any regime based elsewhere simply could not match, because the authority was not symbolic alone, it was something people could feel. The second layer is the Academy, and this is where Bane's story cuts deepest. Academies operated on Korriban across multiple distinct eras, and each reflected the civilization that built it. During the Brotherhood of Darkness, the era Bane lived through and then dismantled, the Academy ran under a philosophy Bane came to regard as deeply flawed, one that rewarded cooperation and collective strength rather than individual power. What united every version of the Academy in every era was its core function. It was a filter. Path of Destruction shows students competing against each other in direct combat and being sent into ancient tombs on assignments expected to kill a significant number of them. The planet's constant darkside pressure bore down on students without relief and without protection. Instructors did not shield them, they evaluated them. The Fallen were not a failure of the design, they were proof it was working. Bane survived, But the planet did far more than test him. His direct encounters with the tombs reshaped him from the ground up. He discovered a holocron that challenged his entire understanding of how the dark side should be practiced, and through it came to see the Brotherhood not as a legitimate order, but as a corruption of everything the ancient lords had built. Path of Destruction shows his time on Korriban not as training but as excavation, the planet stripping away everything in him that was not essential until what remained was harder and sharper than anything that had walked in. By the time he left, Bane was no longer just a formidable man. He carried the authority to dismantle the existing order and replace it with the rule of two. That structure would outlast him by 1,000 years and end with the fall of the Jedi themselves. But none of these parts would matter on their own, and Bane was not the exception. He was proof that the system worked. Together, they create a feedback loop that makes everything else permanent. Force-sensitive people are drawn to the planet from vast distances, some pulled by instinct, others seeking it deliberately. Once on the surface, the effects build. Creeping unease sharpens into dread. Unwanted thoughts arrive that feel less like imagination and more like memory. Visions pull from the specific fears of whoever's standing in the canyon. Those who fall on the planet add more suffering and power to the ground beneath them. Those who survive leave more deeply immersed in the dark side and carry the planet's influence back into the wider galaxy, becoming, knowingly or not, its next recruiters. The cycle has no natural endpoint. It is self-sustaining. By the time Yoda set foot on the surface, this loop had been running uninterrupted for longer than the Republic had existed. The reach of the system extended far beyond the valley itself, and the proof stretches back long before Bane's time. Frieda and Nad sought out the tombs of Korriban, and as told in the Tales of the Jedi comics, found the spirit of the ancient Lord Nagasato waiting inside. He absorbed the teachings of the dark side at their source, and then carried that influence to the distant world of Onderon, where he established his own dark side legacy that persisted for centuries. Korriban did not just hold its power, it exported it. Bane walked into this engine as raw material. He walked out as the most formidable practitioner alive. And when the planet needed to make its most powerful argument against Yoda, the last Jedi who would ever enter the valley, it was Bane's image it chose to send. Korriban had been forging people like Bane for longer than recorded history could fully account for, and for all that time, the galaxy had the power to stop it. Chapter 5: Why It Survived. The reason Korriban survived is more unsettling than anything sealed inside its tombs. The galaxy had the power to act. It had the knowledge. It had the motivation, and at several points in history, it tried. And yet, the system kept running. Not because the Dark Lords were unbeatable, but because every institution that tried to stop it made choices that felt reasonable in the moment, and together guaranteed nothing would ever be finished. Much of the history in this chapter comes from legend sources, where the Republic's repeated failures to deal with Korriban are most fully recorded. The earliest mistake began before Korriban even became a Sith world. The Jedi Order's decision to exile the defeated Darksiders after the 100-Year Darkness was made in genuine good faith. Exile was the compassionate middle ground between execution and indefinite imprisonment. The exiles found Korriban, they founded the Sith tradition. 25,000 years of recurrent conflict trace a direct line back to that single decision. More critically, the choice set an example the galaxy would repeat after every major defeat that followed. Survivors were allowed to scatter rather than being tracked to the end. The most devastating example of what happens when survivors are allowed to scatter is the figure known in legends as Vitiate. After the Republic crushed the Sith Empire in the Great Hyperspace War, Vitiate gathered the remaining lords on a world called Nathema. He drew life force from every one of them and from every other living thing on the planet through a ritual so complete it stripped Nathema of the Force entirely. What had been a living world became a silent, empty shell, a planet with no Force presence at all. As if the energy itself had been ripped out of the ground, Vitiate walked away effectively immortal, disappeared into the unknown regions, and spent over 1,000 years rebuilding in secret before emerging with a fully restored empire. He had trained in Korriban, he had walked the valley and stood in the tombs of the ancient lords. The conviction that power justified everything, that the end of life was a problem to be solved rather than accepted, those were the lessons the planet had been teaching since before he was born. Korriban did not simply shape him, it made him possible. When the Republic tried force instead of patience, the result was no better. The retaliation campaign after that same war was the most aggressive attempt any government ever made to end the threat for good. Sith worlds were struck from orbit, populations were scattered, and temples were deliberately targeted in what was meant as the complete destruction of an entire civilization. And yet, it failed in the one place that actually mattered. Surface structures could be destroyed, physical monuments could be shattered, but the dark side energy stored inside the tombs, the sealed essences, the weapons, the power woven into the rock over millennia, all of it survived the assault untouched. The Republic had leveled every visible sign of a threat while leaving the actual source intact. And now, no one was watching it. The campaign did not destroy the threat, it pushed it deeper underground, leaving it to grow quietly for the next civilization ambitious enough to return. Centuries after the bombardment, a small expedition returned to the Valley of the Dark Lords. They expected ruins. What they found were tombs still active, defenses untouched, the dark side still radiating from the canyon walls as if the war had never happened. The dark side energy stored in the burial chambers had not needed the surface structures to survive. It had been woven into the rock itself, and it was still building. The Republic had declared victory over a world that had not even noticed the attack. Quietly, the most damaging response of all had already been underway for centuries. The Jedi Order did not try to destroy Korriban or reclaim it. They avoided it. Rather than treating the planet as a threat requiring ongoing attention, the Order treated it as something spiritually contaminating, a place where serious study felt forbidden. The Clone Wars shows that when Yoda announced his intention to travel to Korriban, the Council's reaction was not a strategic concern. It was an alarm rooted in legend and institutional reluctance. Every time a Jedi Master warned an apprentice about the dangers of the ancient home world, anyone already drawn towards the dark side heard confirmation that the power was real. The Order's avoidance became a standing invitation, broadcast to everyone the shadow had already reached. And it meant that when Yoda finally decided to go, he went without any institutional knowledge of what he was actually walking into. No Jedi had studied the planet in generations. No protocols existed. He was walking in blind, armed with nothing except the Force and 800 years of training. Compassion that created the enemy. Force that missed the target. Avoidance that advertised the threat. 3 responses across thousands of years, and each decision made sense on its own terms. Together, they guaranteed the system would never stop. At the very end, when the Jedi Order was already in its final years without knowing it, one Jedi finally went to see for himself. Chapter 6: Yoda's Trial. Of all the beings who ever set foot on that world, only one went there not to gain power, but to prove he could survive without wanting it. In the final season of the Clone Wars, Yoda began hearing the voice of Qui-Gon Jinn, the Jedi Master who had fallen on Naboo more than a decade earlier. Qui-Gon had achieved something the Jedi Order had believed lost for centuries, a form of awareness preserved after death, a continuing connection to the living Force. The voice guided Yoda to the priestesses, mysterious beings who existed at a boundary between the living world and what lay beyond it, and who held a secret to life after death. They set Yoda on a series of trials, each one testing a different dimension of what he was and what he carried. One trial forced him to face a shadow inside himself, the parts of his own nature he had spent centuries keeping in check. His purpose through all of it was to preserve the Jedi through whatever lay ahead. The last and deepest trial required him to travel to the one place the Jedi Council had spent generations refusing to go: Korriban. He went knowing exactly what it was. From the moment he entered the atmosphere, The dark side was already pressing against him. It did not wait for him to approach the tombs or descend into the valley. On the surface, the weight was immediate. The canyon walls of the valley rose around him, lined with the same tombs that had been collecting power since before the Republic existed. Every burial chamber he passed still held the sealed essence of the Lord within, and every one of them registered his presence. The Force pressing on him, shown across that final Clone Wars arc, was not passive but directed, searching for entry points, finding the places where even the most disciplined mind carries something unresolved, and leaning on them. The planet showed him a vision of the Clone Wars resolved in a single moment, a false reality where the conflict ended, the Jedi survived, and everything he had been carrying simply stopped hurting. The temple on Coruscant was intact. The younglings were safe. The war had never reached the places it should not have been allowed to reach. It offered him the thing any exhausted leader would want the most, the lie that the struggle was already over. After 800 years of service and 3 years of watching the Order bleed out across a conflict he could not win, that vision was designed to find exactly where Yoda was most tired. He saw through it. Then the planet sent something older against him. Among the things that confronted Yoda was an apparition of Bane, the Lord whose time on Korriban had given him the authority to reshape the entire Order and establish the rule of two. Korriban selected the most potent symbol it had ever produced. Bane was the end product of everything this world had ever made. The man it had shaped and released into the galaxy to change it forever. His image was the planet's most powerful argument, a demonstration that its methods worked. Yoda recognized it for what it was and held his ground. What followed carried more weight than anything that came before it. In the final episode of that arc, Sidious himself reached through the Force to confront Yoda directly. The Dark Lord, who had spent decades orchestrating the fall of the Republic from within, now turned his full attention to the one Jedi who would come closest to sensing his presence. Working through deception and temptation, he forced a choice where every option led to the betrayal of something Yoda held sacred: save one life and condemn another. Act and cause harm, or refuse to act and allow it. And he did not come alone. Every tomb in the valley discharged at once against Yoda. The interconnected burial chambers, the sealed remnants, the dark side energy built into rock over generations of ritual and sacrifice, all of it focused on a single point. In that moment, the full weight of 25,000 years of accumulated power pressed against 800 years of conviction, and Sidious was betting it would be enough. Yoda survived by refusing the terms entirely. He did not choose between the options. He rejected the premise that those were the only choices available. In doing so, he proved the one thing Korriban had never been able to account for in its entire history: someone who could stand inside the full weight of its shadow and simply choose not to be moved by it. The planet had broken students, consumed lords, and buried civilizations. It could not break him. Not because he was stronger, but because he wanted nothing from it. And then he left. He carried what he had learned and told no one. He proposed no follow-up action. He convened no strategic review. Whatever understanding he took from Korriban stayed inside him and went no further into the institution he led. When he returned, the Jedi Order's relationship with the planet was exactly what it had been before he arrived. There was no way to turn one person's understanding into a shared response. And the Order had spent too long not building that kind of process. No one else would learn what he had learned. Within months, the Order would fall. The Clone Wars would end not with the victory Yoda had spent 3 years trying to secure, but with the destruction of almost everything the Jedi had built across generations. The journey that had taken Yoda through the priestesses and through Korriban, the understanding of how to preserve consciousness beyond death, would prove to be among the last things of real value the Old Order produced. Korriban had been the final proving ground, and Yoda had walked out carrying a knowledge that the coming destruction could not erase. Yoda's journey to Korriban was not a turning point, it was a farewell. The deepest terror of Korriban is not the power stored in its tombs or the remnants that still inhabit them. It is the fact that the planet survived, not because of some unstoppable force, but because of ordinary choices made by well-meaning people operating under understandable limits. The Republic commanders who declared victory and went home were not fools. The Jedi who looked away were not cowards. No single person failed. The response failed, and it kept failing so quietly that no one noticed it had become permanent. Just another part of how the galaxy worked. That is the story Korriban tells about the galaxy that created it. Not a story about the power of the dark side, but a story about the cost of choosing comfort over completion, generation after generation, until no single generation could undo what all the ones before it had allowed. Korriban produced Sith Lords across thousands of years, and most of them are remembered for what they did to the galaxy. One of them is remembered for what the galaxy never did to him. Darth Glovoc served Revan's empire, chased a vision to a planet on the edge of nowhere, and chose to wait for the moment the Force was showing him. He has been waiting for 4,000 years. Darth Glovoc is the longest surviving Sith Lord in Star Wars Legends, and somewhere out there, sealed inside an ancient stasis casket on a storm-covered planet in the Mid-Rim, he may still be breathing. No one knows if he will ever wake. No one knows what he would do if he did. And no one, not the Jedi, not the Sith, not the galaxy that has moved on without him for 4,000 years, even knows where to look. He served Revan's empire, chased a Force vision to a world called Nerian, crashed there, and made a choice that placed him outside of time itself, sleeping through Darth Bane, the Clone Wars, Darth Vader, and the fall of the Empire, while the rest of the Sith rose and died were replaced over and over. This is his complete story, drawn entirely from the Legends continuity, and to tell it properly, we've combed through every available source that touches his name. Chapter 1. Lord of the Mind's Eye. Darth Glovoc was one of the most feared commanders in Revan's Sith Empire, a military mind the Order valued, a Sith the Order kept at arm's length, and a man whose victories on the battlefield were matched only by the reputation for instability that followed him everywhere. He was responsible for several highly successful campaigns against the Galactic Republic during the Jedi Civil War. He was valued and feared. In an order built on strength and ruthlessness, that meant something. But Glovoc was not like the other Sith commanders, where most of his peers spent their off hours sharpening blades or consolidating power. Glovoc disappeared into meditation. He was brilliant, but also believed to be somewhat insane, a reputation he did nothing to discourage. He spent the majority of his free time in deep meditative states, not the careful, controlled meditation of a Jedi trying to quiet the mind, but a plunging, searching kind of focus that pushed outward through the Force, seeking something he couldn't quite name. He called this practice his true work. He called himself, with complete seriousness, the Lord of the Mind's Eye. Other Sith thought he was unhinged. They tolerated him because of his results on the battlefield, but they kept their distance. A commander who spent more time in trance than in briefings made people uncomfortable, and in an empire built on domination and calculated cruelty, discomfort was enough to mark someone as a liability. Yet Glovoc didn't care. He had a short temper and absolute faith in his visions, a combination that made him dangerous to argue with. He was known to execute subordinates who contradicted his interpretation of what the Force was showing him, and when pushed far enough, he could subject a person to a slow and agonizing death. He was not a Sith Lord who inspired loyalty through charisma. He inspired it through fear, and through the undeniable fact that his campaigns worked. What he was actually searching for in all those hours of meditation was the key to the Sith's ultimate victory over the Republic and the Jedi. That was the goal he had given himself. Not just battlefield success, but some deeper answer, some insight the dark side might deliver if he was patient enough and willing to push far enough into the void between thoughts. He believed the Force was trying to show him something, and that if he listened long enough, it would. For years, it didn't. He kept fighting, kept winning, kept meditating while the war ground on. Then, near the closing years of the Jedi Civil War, under Darth Malgus' rule, Darth Glovoc finally got his answer. It came in a dream, and when he woke from it, everything he had spent years fighting for suddenly meant nothing compared to what it was showing him. Chapter 2. The Vision. Inside his mind, In the deep place he had spent years trying to reach, Glovoc saw a world. It was dark, not the comfortable darkness of deep space, but a churning, living darkness. The planet was wrapped entirely in thick, layered cloud, the kind that made the surface invisible from orbit. Through those clouds, violet lightning tore in long, jagged bolts, like dark energy made visible. The whole world pulsed with a strange electricity. He couldn't see what was on the surface. He couldn't see what was down there, but something in the vision reached him in a way years of meditation had not. The Force was not whispering this time. It was pointing. Glovoc woke up absolutely certain that that's what he had been looking for, and that he had to find it immediately. What exactly he believed the planet held is not spelled out in the source material. The vision filled him with an overwhelming desire to investigate. He was sure the dark side was telling him something significant was there, and he didn't feel the need to explain himself further to anyone who questioned him. When a subordinate apparently pushed back on his interpretation of the dream, Glovoc's response was the kind that ended conversations. He began searching his records for any system that matched what he had seen. He was looking for a world with permanent cloud cover in a region the Sith hadn't thoroughly explored, a world that had been passed over or ignored because there was no obvious strategic value in cataloging it. After combing through navigation data, he found what he was looking for, the Lure system. Tucked away in the mid-rim, home to a fifth planet that matched his vision almost exactly. Glovoc received his vision during the final months of the Jedi Civil War, at the precise moment when the conflict was approaching its breaking point. Darth Malgus was fighting to hold the Sith Empire together. The redeemed Revan, his memories restored, his identity rebuilt by the Jedi, was moving against the Starforge, the ancient Rakatan superweapon that powered the Sith war machine. Everything was in motion. The outcome of the war was no longer certain, and in that moment, Glovoc made a decision that shocked even the people who already thought he was losing his mind. He abandoned the war entirely. He took command of an interdictor-class warship called the Dying Sun and ordered his crew to set course for the Lure system. He left no explanation that the sources record. He simply went. The remaining Sith Empire, which had bigger problems to deal with than tracking down one eccentric commander, took a mild interest in his destination and then moved on. The Sith as a whole registered Glovoc's vision and the Lure system with passing curiosity, nothing more. As the Dying Sun moved through hyperspace toward Nerian, Glovoc slept again. He spent the journey with his mind's eye extended outward, trying to reach the world ahead of him, trying to pierce the cloud cover in his thoughts before his ship arrived in person. He couldn't. Something about the planet resisted his attempts to probe it from a distance. Whatever was down there was not giving itself up easily. That should have been a warning. Chapter 3. The Dying Sun Falls. The Dying Sun arrived at Nerian in 3956 BBY. From orbit, the planet looked exactly like Glovoc's dream. Thick, churning clouds covered every surface of the world below, and purple lightning cracked through the layers in long, brilliant flashes. The crew ran active scans. They needed to understand what they were looking at before anyone descended. That decision cost them. The active sensors were powerful enough to do their job, and powerful enough to be detected. Glovoc was so focused on Nerian, so deep in his attempt to read the planet, that he didn't sense the Republic vessels approaching until it was already too late. He had come all this way chasing a vision, and in the moment of arrival, his obsession with the planet below became the thing that blinded him to the threat beside him. A Republic strike force had stumbled into the Lure system, and when they found a Sith interdictor-class warship sitting in orbit over an uncharted planet, they didn't ask questions. The battle that followed was brief and violent. The Dying Sun's crew was Sith-trained, and they fought hard. They managed to destroy 3 Republic cruisers and a significant number of Republic starfighters before the tide turned. But 3 cruisers were not enough. The Republic forces kept pressing, and the Dying Sun was taking hits it couldn't absorb. Torpedoes struck critical systems. The warship that had carried Glovoc across the galaxy in search of his vision began to come apart. Caught in Nerian's gravity well, the Dying Sun couldn't escape. Its orbit decayed. It broke into pieces as it fell, sections of the hull separating as the atmosphere tore at the damaged frame, and what remained hit the surface in a crash that any surviving crew member was lucky to walk away from. Escape pods from both sides rained down alongside the debris. None of them was ever heard from again. The Republic forces, having dealt what they calculated as a killing blow to an enemy warship, in a remote system, recorded the engagement and moved on. They never stopped to ask why a Sith commander had been orbiting an unremarkable mid-rim planet in the first place. The Republic simply assumed the dying sun had been hiding, avoiding discovery in a quiet corner of space. They didn't know what they had stumbled into, and they never went back to find out. On the surface of Nerion, among the scattered wreckage and the survivors who had made it through the crash, Darth Glovoc was still alive. His survival was nothing short of miraculous. The crash of the dying sun should not have left many people standing, but Glovoc was standing, and a handful of his crew were with him, and the planet that had called to him from the other side of a dream was now all around them. It was everything the vision had shown. The cloud cover so thick that nothing in the sky was visible, the lightning cracking constantly through layers of storm, the air heavy and electric in a way that made the Force behave strangely. When Glovoc attempted to reach outward through the Force to sense the planet the way he had tried to from orbit, he found the same wall he had encountered on the voyage over. His mental probes couldn't breach the cloud layer. Whatever the interference was, whether it came from the atmosphere itself, from something in the ionosphere, from the magnetic field that drove the endless storms, it cut off Force perception in both directions. A Force user on the surface could not sense space, and a Force user in space could not sense anything below. The dark side had led him here, and here, the dark side couldn't fully reach him. Chapter 4. Stranded. What Glovoc did next defined what kind of leader he actually was beneath the meditation and the visions. He organized the survivors, however many of his crew had made it through the crash, and the escape pods, pulling them together under his authority. He turned them toward the problem of staying alive on a planet none of them had ever intended to land on. He was described during this period as a harsh but effective leader. The same qualities that had made him successful on the battlefield now directed towards survival instead of conquest. Nerion was not a welcoming world. The tempests were constant, with storms of varying intensity cycling across the surface throughout the year. The lightning made open ground dangerous. The cloud cover blocked any reliable view of the stars, which meant the disorientation of an unfamiliar world was compounded by the inability to navigate by the sky. They had the wreckage of the dying sun, whatever equipment had survived, and each other. They also had the dark side, and on the surface, at least, the Force still worked. It just couldn't reach beyond the atmosphere. Over time, Glovoc's people encountered the native inhabitants of Nerion. These interactions were hostile. The Sith survivors preyed on the natives when they could, and the wider population of Nerion learned quickly to avoid the area where Glovoc's group had settled. It was a harsh equilibrium. The Sith were too dangerous to approach, too small a group to threaten the planet as a whole, and too stranded to go anywhere. As time passed, Glovoc continued his meditation. The planet's force-dampening qualities never stopped bothering him. His disciples began to speculate about the source of the interference, and that speculation hardened over the years into something close to belief, a conviction that something within Nerion itself was causing the phenomenon, not the weather, not the physics, but something that lived inside the world, something that had been there long before they arrived. Glovoc never confirmed it. He just kept meditating, kept pushing his perception towards the barrier, and kept failing. It was somewhere in these years, stranded on a planet that resisted his greatest ability, that Darth Glovoc made the decision that would make him the longest surviving Sith in recorded history. He wasn't gonna die on Nerion, not of age, not of attrition, not of the slow, grinding defeat of watching his people dwindle while the galaxy moved on without him. If the Force had brought him here for a reason, he intended to be alive when that reason became clear. He had an oubliette. An oubliette was a Sith stasis casket, an artifact of considerable power and rarity. The only other oubliette documented in the Legend's continuity was created by the ancient Sith Lord Remulus Drapa to imprison his rival Carnes Mir, as documented in the Legends Vector crossover comic arc, containing both the Sith Lord and the dangerous influence of the Mir talisman. These devices were not ordinary tools. They required significant knowledge to construct, and even more to use safely. The fact that Glovoc possessed one aboard the Dying Sun says something about how seriously the Sith took his abilities, and how prepared he had been for possibilities he couldn't have fully anticipated. Inside the oubliette A person could be kept alive for thousands of years, not frozen in the conventional sense, not carbonite, not cryostasis, but suspended in a deep, dark side sleep that slowed the body's processes to something close to nothing. It was sleep taken to its ultimate limit. It was the closest thing a mortal being could achieve to stepping outside of time. So he climbed in, and the galaxy moved on without him. Chapter 5: The Sleeping God. At first, he set limits for himself. Glovoc initially restricted his time in stasis to periods of roughly 100 years, long enough to sleep through the slow grind of history, short enough to check on the world he left behind. He would emerge, assess the situation, how many of his people were left, what condition they were in, whether any opportunity for escape from Nerion had presented itself, and then return to the casket and sleep again. One look at the world before going dark once more. What he found each time he emerged is not detailed in the source material, but the pattern of what happened to his followers is. These Sith survivors marooned across generations on a storm-covered planet with no way off, and a culture built around a leader who disappeared for a century at a time began to change. The process was stark. Over the millennia, they became twisted and inbred, their physical forms warping alongside their minds, their understanding of Sith discipline eroding into something more primal. They stopped being Sith warriors. They became something else entirely. The Children of the Tempest. It was the name of people who had been shaped by the storms, who had grown up under an unbroken ceiling of cloud, who had never once in their lives seen a clear sky. They hunted with spears. They howled like animals when they fought, a geologically active area where the ground itself breathed heat, and they performed rituals there that bore only a passing resemblance to anything that could be traced back to Sith doctrine. At the center of it all was the oubliette, the casket where their lord slept. The children called him the Dying Sun, taking the name from the wreckage of the ship that had brought them to this world. They built their reverence around his sleeping form. To them, he was not simply a commander or Dark Lord, he was a god. A deity who had chosen to rest until the right moment, who would one day open his eyes and lead them out of Nerion and into whatever greatness awaited beyond the storms. They sacrificed to him. They protected him with absolute ferocity. Any threat to the oubliette was a threat to the divine, and they responded accordingly. Glovoc, meanwhile, was sleeping more and more. His periods of consciousness grew increasingly infrequent as the centuries passed. Whether this was by design, or simply the casket doing its work, pulling him deeper the longer he stayed, is not recorded. What is clear is that, at some point, he stopped emerging at all. The 100-year intervals gave way to longer silences, and then to no intervals at all. He was in perpetual stasis. The world moved on without him. Centuries became millennia. The Jedi Civil War that had defined his entire career dissolving into ancient history, while the Republic that had shot him down over Nerion was replaced, reformed, shattered, and rebuilt again and again around him. Darth Bane rose and established the rule of two. Hundreds of Sith came and went under that rule, each one part of a dynasty that Glovoc had no knowledge of. The Sith disappeared from public view for 1,000 years. Then came Darth Sidious, the Clone Wars, the rise of the Empire, the destruction of the Death Star, Vader's fall, and Palpatine's death at Endor, and finally the birth of the New Republic. All of it unfolding while Glovoc breathed his slow, impossible breaths inside his casket on a planet nobody was looking for. The only disruption in his perfect unconsciousness came after Nerion was eventually colonized. As the planet began to develop, as more people arrived and settlements grew and the world became less isolated, the disturbance reached Glovoc even in stasis. His sleep became fitful, restless, as if something in the increasing presence of life and activity on the surface was penetrating the deep stillness the casket maintained. His followers tried everything they knew to wake him, pressing their hands to the casket, performing their rituals with greater intensity, calling to him in whatever language the Children of the Tempest had developed over the generations. But nothing worked. He wouldn't stir. Darth Glovoc was past the point where waking up was simple. He had gone too deep. Time had accumulated around him like weight, and pulling him back was not something his deformed descendants could manage on their own. Chapter 6: The One Sith Comes Calling. In 132 ABY, nearly 4,000 years after Darth Glovoc had first sealed himself into the casket, someone finally came looking for him. The galaxy at this point was under Darth Krayt's One Sith, and Krayt was hungry for anything that might strengthen his grip. Artifacts, knowledge, history. Rumors had reached his agents. Whispers about a Sith warship called the Dying Sun, which had vanished during the Jedi Civil War and never been accounted for, and what it might have been carrying when it disappeared. Krayt dispatched one of his Sith Lords to investigate. His name was Darth Vuric, and he traveled to Nerion to find whatever the Dying Sun had left behind. What Vuric found when he arrived was not what he expected. He located the Sith settlement without too much difficulty. After 4,000 years, the Children of the Tempest had developed enough of a presence on Nerion that finding them was possible for someone who knew what to look for. But finding them and getting past them were different problems entirely. The deformed descendants of Glovoc's crew did not receive Vuric as a fellow Sith. They received him as a threat to their god. They attacked immediately, and Vuric cut through many of them. The one Sith Lord was powerful, and the Children of the Tempest, however devoted, were not trained warriors. But there were enough of them, and their protectiveness of the casket was absolute. Every step Vuric took towards Glovoc's sleeping form was contested. Then the situation complicated itself further. Other people on Nerion had noticed what was happening, local clan members, and among them a group of fugitive Jedi who had been living on the planet in hiding recognized that a one Sith Lord was attacking a settlement. They moved to intervene. Several of these Jedi confronted Vuric directly. The fight that followed went badly for both sides. Vuric wounded several of the Jedi and killed at least one, but he couldn't hold off both the Children of the Tempest and the Jedi simultaneously, and eventually he was forced to retreat to Locus, Nerion's capital city. While Vuric was occupied with the Jedi, the Children of the Tempest did exactly what they had been born to do. They protected their god, moving with a speed and coordination that surprised people who had only seen them as deformed and primitive. They relocated Glovoc's casket. By the time Vuric had extracted himself from the confrontation and turned back toward the settlement, it was gone, hidden somewhere in Nerion's vast, storm-covered terrain, in a location the children would die before revealing. Vuric was left with nothing. No Glovoc, no holocrons, no artifacts from Revan's era. He had come all this way and had only bodies and failure to show for it, and he couldn't bring himself to report that failure to Darth Krayt. Instead, he stayed on Nerion. He hired bounty hunters to track down the Jedi who had interfered with his mission, hoping to eliminate the witnesses to his defeat before anyone could report back, and he continued his search for the casket, quietly hoping that persistence would eventually turn up what Force had not. Whether he ever found it is not recorded. Whether Glovoc is still out there, still breathing in the dark beneath Nerion storms, is not confirmed one way or the other. He outlasted everyone. That is the simplest way to say it, and also the cruelest. Every Sith Lord who rose after him, Darth Bane, Darth Sidious, Darth Vader, Darth Krayt, shaped the galaxy in ways that Glovoc never could. Wars were won and lost in his name's absence. Dynasties built themselves from nothing, burned the stars, and collapsed into dust. And through all of it, the Lord of the Mind's Eye lay sealed in his casket on a forgotten planet, breathing, technically alive, and completely irrelevant. He had gone into stasis to wait for the moment the Force was showing him. He had waited 4,000 years. The galaxy never came back for him. The dark side that had pulled him to Nerion never offered a second answer. The vision that had seemed so certain, so urgent, so obviously the thing his entire career had been building toward, it led him to a planet with no way off, and then left him there. He's the longest surviving Sith in recorded history. He survived everything, and history forgot him anyway. Glovoc was forgotten. Other events in galactic history were impossible to forget. Across 25,000 years of recorded civilization, the galaxy has produced 12 disasters whose damage outlasted every regime that watched them happen. None of these are battles. They are the moments where something broke and stayed broken. The Star Wars galaxy goes back over 25,000 years. During that time, certain events stand apart from normal battles and wars because they change the galaxy in ways that could never be fixed. Some of these disasters are well known from the films, while others come from novels, games, and comics that most fans have never seen. However, all of them left damage that lasted for generations. Here are the 12 worst disasters in Star Wars history. Jedha held no military value, but it carried spiritual meaning for the entire galaxy. In the film Rogue One, the city was tied to ancient Force traditions and held kyber crystal sites older than the Jedi Order itself. For thousands of years, pilgrims from hundreds of worlds visited Jedha to learn that the Force belonged to everyone, not just Jedi or Sith. Then the Death Star test changed everything. Director Krennic ordered the station to fire at low power because the Empire wanted proof that kyber-powered weapons worked at a large scale. The city was gone. The planet survived, but millions did not. In an instant, the blast damaged the air and caused huge harm across the region. Ancient temples vanished, and records holding centuries of Force knowledge disappeared in seconds. As a result, this event proved the Death Star worked. The weapon could be set to wipe out a city or an entire planet, and fear spread across the galaxy even before the official word came out. However, this was only the beginning. The next target proved the Empire would give up even its own property to stay in control. The Battle of Scarif was a fight where both sides lost everything they brought. In Rogue One, Scarif served as the Empire's main data storage base and held the most secret Imperial records, including the Death Star plans. A huge shield gate protected the world from orbit, making ground attacks impossible without first winning the control of space. Despite these odds, the Rebel Alliance attacked anyway. They sent their entire strike force with no escape plan because everyone understood the risks. Their goal was simple but desperate: send the Death Star plans off-world before Imperial backup arrived. Rebels fought on the beaches of Scarif to buy time for a single data transfer that could change the war. Against all odds, they succeeded. The plans reached the Rebel fleet moments before the Death Star arrived. Then, the Empire wiped out everything. The film shows a single blast clearing the entire surface base. Rather than let the Rebels keep what they had found, the Empire gave up its own records, its own workers, and the Rebel ground forces all at once. This victory came at a huge cost for both sides. The Death Star plans let the Rebels find a weakness in the battle station, leading to its end at Yavin. At the same time, the Rebel Alliance lost skilled fighters, trained pilots, and resources that it can never replace. In the end, the rebellion came out weaker in numbers, but armed with proof that the Empire would give up anything to hold power. But worse was still to come. The next event showed the Empire would wipe out entire worlds without pause. Alderaan chose peace and paid the ultimate price for it. In the film A New Hope, the planet had no shields and no military. Its people lived in open cities on a defenseless world. For centuries, this choice had made Alderaan strong as a center of culture, art, and learning because it posed no threat to anyone. Then the Death Star fired at full power. The planet broke apart completely. In the film, Alderaan is shown coming apart from the inside out. The surface cracked, the core blew up, and within seconds, the entire world became a field of broken pieces. Billions of lives ended at once with no warning and no chance to escape. This attack came just days after the Empire had shut down the Imperial Senate. With Alderaan gone and the Senate closed, the message was clear. The Empire no longer needed to pretend that it served the people, and fear would replace cooperation as the basis of Imperial rule. Grand Moff Tarkin believed wiping out one world would scare thousands into giving up. Fear did spread, and neutral systems understood the threat. However, terror also creates resistance. Systems that might have stayed neutral now faced only two choices: give in completely or fight back. Many chose to fight, and the Rebel Alliance grew stronger after Alderaan rather than weaker. Officers left the Empire and joined the Rebels, while resources flowed in from systems that had never supported the rebellion before. To this day, later canon sources confirm that Alderaan's broken pieces remain visible as a lasting reminder that some choices cannot be undone. Yet, Alderaan was not the first great loss that the galaxy had faced. Years before Alderaan, a different kind of loss had already reshaped the galaxy. The Jedi Order had protected the galaxy for over 1,000 generations and was wiped out in a single day. Both Revenge of the Sith and the Clone Wars show that the Order numbered in the thousands and had served as peacekeepers of the Galactic Republic. They kept temples across many worlds and saved knowledge of the Force going back to the earliest written records. Then, Order 66 ended all of it. Across the galaxy, clone soldiers turned on their Jedi commanders at the exact same moment. This betrayal was especially hard because the Jedi had trusted the clone army completely after fighting together for years. Jedi Masters knew individual clones by name and had shared victories, losses, and countless battles together. Yet the series reveals that the clones had no choice in what happened. Control chips placed in them during their creation forced them to obey when the Order came. The Jedi did not know about the chips. They only saw soldiers they had trusted turning weapons against them without warning and without mercy. As a result, within hours, Jedi Masters were gone on distant battlefields, and Council members were overwhelmed in the Jedi Temple on Coruscant. The few Jedi who survived did so through luck, quick thinking, or the help of clones who managed to resist their programming. The losses went far beyond the immediate count. Beyond the immediate losses, the Jedi Order lost everything it had built over thousands of years. Training centers were seized or shut down, and records holding gathered wisdom came under Sith control. Holocrons, special devices holding the recorded teachings of past Jedi Masters, were taken or broken. Making matters worse, canon sources including Rebels and Obi-Wan Kenobi show that children born with Force abilities faced a terrible fate in the years that followed. Imperial Inquisitors hunted them across the galaxy. Those who escaped grew up hiding their gifts because they were afraid to use abilities they did not understand. With no Jedi to oppose them, Palpatine and Vader controlled how the entire galaxy understood the Force. The light side became a myth, while the dark side became the only known path to power. This situation lasted for nearly 2 decades. Even so, the galaxy's suffering was not over. When Palpatine finally fell, he made sure the galaxy would suffer one more time. Both the Shattered Empire comic series and the game Battlefront 2 confirmed that Palpatine planned for his own end, but did not try to prevent it. Instead, he made sure the galaxy would be punished for allowing it to happen. Once word of the Emperor's end reached the Imperial Command, Operation Cinder started on its own. There was no review, no discussion, and no chance to reconsider. The plan Palpatine had prepared years in advance simply began. The targets were not rebel bases or enemy worlds, but rather loyal Imperial planets. Planets that had supported the Empire faithfully for decades suddenly found themselves marked for harm. According to canon sources, weather control satellites deployed across these worlds, creating huge storms, terrible flooding, and widespread crop failures. Unlike the Death Star, the harm happened slowly over days rather than seconds. People watched the storms approach and understood what was happening, but they had no way to stop it. The purpose was punishment rather than military gain. As a result, Operation Cinder ended whatever trust remained in the Empire. Worlds that had been loyal watched Imperial forces attack Imperial citizens. The message was impossible to ignore. The Empire had never protected its own, and it never would. Because of this, no stable Imperial government could follow Palpatine. Officers found themselves commanding forces that had just attacked loyal populations, and the political center fell apart completely. Canon sources confirm that Operation Cinder served no military purpose at all. It gained no territory, defeated no enemies, and reached no military goal. It existed only to cause suffering as Palpatine's final act. In time, the galaxy began to heal. The New Republic eventually rose from the chaos, but decades later, history repeated itself. The New Republic was erased before it even knew it was under attack. The Force Awakens reveals that the New Republic chose to rotate its capital between member worlds to prevent any single planet from gaining too much power. Different systems took turns hosting the government. When the First Order fired at Starkiller Base, the Hosnian system held the rotating capital. The timing was on purpose because the First Order had waited for exactly this moment. The weapon fired through hyperspace, which meant that there was no approaching threat that sensors could detect. There was no warning of any kind, and the beam arrived in the Hosnian system before anyone knew to be afraid. An entire star system was gone in seconds. In seconds, multiple planets vanished at once, and the Republic fleet station in the system was lost completely. The Senate building was erased, along with everyone inside. Every elected leader, every government worker, and every record was gone. Military command failed right away as officers in distant systems waited for orders that would never come because no one remained to give them. This event ended more than lives and buildings. It ended the government itself. When Alderaan was gone decades earlier, the Imperial Senate still existed briefly, and some structure remained. In contrast, the Hosnian loss left nothing at all. There was no backup capital waiting and no plan for what came next. The New Republic's ability to respond as a unified government ended completely in those few seconds. In the aftermath, the First Order rose without real opposition. Individual systems faced the same choice their grandparents had faced: give in to the new threat or try to resist alone. Most gave in, while the few who resisted became the base of the resistance. The Force Awakens confirms that a full generation had passed since the original Death Star's end. The galaxy had rebuilt, and peace had seemed secure. Then another superweapon erased another peaceful system, and the galaxy proved just as unprepared as before. This was not the first time hope had been destroyed in this way. Centuries before these events, another symbol of hope had fallen during the High Republic era. Starlight Beacon represented everything the Republic hoped to become. In the High Republic novels and comics, the station served as a huge relief hub, sending aid to worlds in crisis. It stood as a symbol of what the Jedi and the Republic could do together, floating at the edge of known space as a sign of hope on the frontier. Nihil understood exactly what ending Starlight Beacon would mean. They used the chaos of hyperspace problems to sneak into the station, then brought it down while the entire galaxy watched. As a result, Jedi and Republic workers lost their lives, resources and ships were lost, and peace efforts that had taken years to build fell apart overnight. At the same time, the mental damage proved even greater than the physical losses. High Republic sources show that faith in growth fell apart across the frontier. Worlds that had seemed safe realized that safety had been a lie, and systems began to question whether Republic presence made them targets rather than partners. Jedi trust suffered as well because the Order had shown Starlight Beacon as proof of their commitment to peace and service. Its end suggested that the Jedi could not protect even their most visible project. This event marked a turning point in High Republic history. Before Starlight, the era was defined by growth and hope for the future. After Starlight, fear and defensive thinking took over. The Nihil had ended belief in what the Republic stood for. Remarkably, the Nihil were not even the worst danger of this age. The Nihil were not the first threat to come from hyperspace during this era. The Great Hyperspace Disaster made the entire galaxy question whether faster-than-light travel was safe. According to the High Republic novel Light of the Jedi, hyperspace travel had worked safely for thousands of years. Ships entered hyperspace, traveled faster than light, and came out at their destinations without trouble. The technology was understood. The routes were mapped and everyone trusted that the system worked. Then the Great Hyperspace Disaster ended that trust completely. It began when a large transport vessel called the Legacy Run was lost while traveling through hyperspace. Normally, the loss of a ship in hyperspace would be a contained tragedy. However, when the Legacy Run broke apart, something never seen before happened. Pieces of the lost ship came out of hyperspace at extreme speed and became weapons no one could predict or stop. The novel describes these events as emergences. Broken parts appeared without warning across a vast region of space at near light speed. They could not be tracked before they arrived or stopped once they appeared. Whatever they hit was gone right away. Soon after, planets were hit without warning while space stations were lost. Trade routes that had operated safely for centuries became deadly dangerous. No one knew where the next emergence would occur or when, because the broken parts could appear anywhere along the path that the Legacy run had traveled. For the first time in recorded history, the galaxy questioned whether hyperspace itself was safe. Because of this, trade routes were left empty, and business between systems slowed down badly. Worlds that depended on space shipping found themselves cut off from supplies that they needed. The vast network of hyperspace lanes that made galactic life possible suddenly seemed weak and unreliable. What made this disaster especially frightening was that it was not a weapon. No enemy had planned it, and no villain had meant for it to happen. A weapon can be found and ended, and an enemy can be spotted and defeated. An accident, on the other hand, can happen again at any time without warning, without cause, and without any way to prevent it. High Republic sources confirm this disaster prove that systems the entire galaxy depended upon could fail badly without any warning at all. Now, the remaining entries come from legend stories, and the first shows that weapons built to end wars can become the war's greatest crime. The mass shadow generator ended the Mandalorian Wars by destroying both sides at once. In the game Knights of the Old Republic 2, the weapon was designed to end a conflict that had dragged on for years. By that point, Republic forces had suffered defeat after defeat, and world after world had fallen to Mandalorian conquest. Republic leadership was desperate for any advantage, and the weapon at Malachor 5 promised to end the war in a single battle. The mass shadow generator controlled gravity on a planetary scale. When turned on, it would create gravity forces strong enough to crush anything in range. Ships, soldiers, vehicles, and buildings would all be gone because nothing could survive what the weapon would create. Then Republic Command turned on the weapon during the peak of battle, when both the Mandalorian and Republic fleets filled the space above Malachor 5 while both armies covered the surface below. The trap was set. When the weapon activated, there was no way to escape. The game depicts ships collapsing in orbit as gravity grew beyond any survivable level. Entire fleets crumpled with their hulls crushed like thin metal. On the surface, both armies were pressed into the ground. Mandalorians and Republic soldiers alike were gone together. Their battle ended in shared loss. The Mandalorian Wars ended with that battle, and the Mandalorian threat was broken. However, victory meant nothing to those who had fallen, and those who survived found that survival carried its own cost. Those who lived through Malachor 5 carried deep wounds that never healed. In the years that followed, survivors went through heavy mental pain after witnessing warfare without limits. Victory had required the Republic to lose its own forces along with the enemy, and many survivors could not accept what they had been part of. Some turned to the dark side, seeking power to ensure they would never be so helpless again, while others simply broke under the weight of what they had seen. Legend sources often name Malachor 5 as proof that total war makes victory meaningless. The Republic won the battle and the war. But the Republic that came out was not the same group that had entered the conflict. In the same way, the Jedi who survived were not the same Jedi who had once sworn to protect all life. As terrible as this was, another weapon caused even stranger damage. The mass shadow generator turned gravity into a weapon. The next disaster turned the Force itself into a weapon. The Thought Bomb was unlike any other weapon ever created. As described in the Darth Bane novel trilogy, the Sith created this weapon to turn the Force into a tool of harm. The goal was not to channel the Force or direct it towards a target, but rather to make the energy that connected all living things into a bomb. To create this weapon required huge amounts of dark side power. Multiple Sith Lords had to channel their hatred and rage together while feeding the bomb until it reached full power. When finally set off, The thought bomb would end every Force-sensitive being within its range. The weapon made no difference between Sith and Jedi. It would take both equally. According to the trilogy, the blast erased everyone present who could touch the Force. Sith Lords who had spent decades gathering power vanished alongside the Jedi who would come to stop them. Centuries of learning, training, and tradition disappeared in a single moment. When the blast ended, the battlefield fell completely silent. That silence was not peace because the thought bomb had left damage that would not heal. The blast site remained wounded for generations. In the aftermath, legend sources describe a scar in the Force staying at the spot where the thought bomb had gone off. Force users who came near the site felt pain, confusion, and darkness pressing against their minds because the bomb had damaged reality itself by creating a wound that refused to close. After the event, knowledge of the thought bomb method was hidden on purpose. Sith who survived the era refused to teach it to their students, and Jedi who learned of its existence worked to ensure the information was lost. For perhaps the only time in history, both sides of the Force agreed completely that some weapons should never be used again. Yet even this was not the worst thing ever done to the Force. The thought bomb damaged the Force in one spot. The next disaster erased the Force from an entire world. Nathema is the only world in the galaxy where the Force was completely erased from existence. The Old Republic game and related materials depict Nathema as once a living world with cities, nature, and millions of beings. The Force flowed through it just as it flowed through every other world in the galaxy. Then, the Sith Emperor performed his ritual. This ritual required sacrifice on a scale never tried before or since. The Sith Emperor gathered his followers and drew upon their power while channeling everything they had towards a single goal, his own continued life. However, the ritual demanded far more than his followers could provide. It demanded everything on the planet. The ritual drained all life and all Force presence at the same time. According to legend sources, every living thing on Nathema was emptied. Plants, animals, and people were all consumed. The Force itself was stripped completely away, leaving an empty space where energy should have existed. As a result, Nathema became a place where the Force simply did not exist. Force users who came near the planet grew weak. In the game, the closer a Force user came to Nathema, the more their connection to the Force faded and failed. On the surface, that connection vanished entirely. Jedi and Sith alike became ordinary beings unable to touch the power that had defined their entire lives. Even now, the planet cannot recover from what had been done. Life cannot return because seeds planted in the soil will not grow, and animals brought to the surface cannot survive. The conditions required for life had been permanently consumed. To this day, legend sources confirm that even other Sith viewed Nathema as wrong on a deep level. The planet had not ended in any normal sense. It had been unmade, and life itself had been erased from that world. All of these disasters were terrible, but none of them compare to what comes next. Every disaster on this list caused millions or billions of losses. The final entry caused trillions. The Yuuzhan Vong War was fought against an enemy the galaxy had never seen before. As told in the new Jedi Order novel series, the Yuuzhan Vong were a species from outside the known galaxy with technology, biology, and beliefs unlike anything ever seen. Their ships were grown from living tissue rather than built from metal. Their weapons were creatures bred for war rather than machines. Their culture worshipped pain and sacrifice in ways that made peaceful talks impossible. Most importantly, the series makes clear that the Yuuzhan Vong were completely invisible to the Force. Jedi could not sense them coming, could not predict their movements, and could not read their intentions. The abilities that had made Jedi effective for thousands of generations offered nothing against this enemy. For the first time in recorded history, the Force could not help. The war lasted for years, and total losses reached into the trillions. In fact, legend sources confirm the scale of harm went beyond anything ever seen in all of recorded history. Entire worlds were consumed by the invasion, while populations numbering in the billions were lost. Cities that had stood for ages became rubble, shipyards, space stations, and communication systems were targeted and ended one by one. Even worse, planets that resisted the Yuuzhan Vong were not simply conquered. According to the series, these worlds were changed into something alien as native life was consumed, while strange structures grew from living material that had once been buildings and cities. Galactic governments collapsed and reformed multiple times during the war. As a result, the New Republic fell because its government could not put together the response that an invasion of this scale required. Replacement governments rose to take its place and tried to organize resistance, but they eventually fell as well. Alliances formed between former enemies, broke apart under the pressure of constant defeat, and reformed in new ways. Nothing remained stable because stability was impossible. At the same time, legend sources describe the Yuuzhan Vong adapting to every plan developed against them. When resistance grew strong in one area, they simply attacked somewhere else. The war ground forward year after year, consuming resources and ending populations. Entire generations grew up knowing nothing except war. During this time, children were born after the invasion had already begun, and they learned about loss before they understood what peace meant. Fear was a constant companion throughout their childhoods. By the time the war finally ended, these children had become adults who carried the conflict inside them. They could not picture a galaxy without enemies because they had never known one. The series confirms this war stands as the single greatest lasting disaster in all of galactic history. The effects lasted long after the fighting stopped. In the end, survivors carried memories of loss that shaped every decision they made afterward. Trust between peoples and governments became difficult. Groups that rebuilt after the war did so around the idea that another invasion could come at any time. The galaxy that came out of the Yuuzhan Vong War was harder, more watchful, and more heavily armed than the galaxy that had existed before. No other event in canon or legends comes close to this level of destruction. The Yuuzhan Vong War stands alone as the moment when the galaxy came closest to complete end and barely survived. From these tragedies, a clear pattern emerges. The galaxy does not fall because of villains alone, but because multiple systems fail at once. Trust breaks down, key systems collapse, and belief in shared values shatters. Yet the Star Wars galaxy endures. Empires rise and eventually fall, while republics collapse and later reform. The Jedi vanish and then return. Through every disaster, some thread of life survives, and some base remains upon which the next generation can rebuild. However, lasting is not the same as healing, and survival is not the same as getting back what was lost. The galaxy that exists after a disaster is never quite the same as the galaxy that existed before. These 12 events left marks that time alone could not erase. If you want to learn more about the dark side that caused many of these disasters, we have a video explaining the ranks and structure of the Sith Order, from the lowest acolytes to the most powerful Dark Lords. Or if you want something longer to relax with, we have over 2 hours of Star Wars theories, perfect for winding down at the end of the day. Quick note before you go, members get early access and a few videos that stay off the main channel. If that's interesting, the link's in the description. Otherwise, here's another video you might like.